This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by.
Welcome everyone to today's Environment Committee meeting. Members of the public may like to follow at London Assembly on X and use the hashtag #AssemblyEnvironment for this meeting. May I please remind everyone to switch phones to silent mode and ask that members and guests ensure that electronic devices are not placed in front of their microphones. Members and guests are also reminded to position their microphones so that it can be heard clearly. If you need to move your microphone, please do it by picking up the base and not the gooseneck of the microphone. The main item for discussion today is local food growing in London. Before we begin, we just have a few quick items of business to attend to. Can I now ask our committee officer, Sal Faisal, to confirm any apologies for today's meeting?
Thank you, Chair. No apologies have been received.
Thank you, Sal. Declarations of interest. Can I ask the committee to note the recommendations set out at item 2 and ask if members have any other interest to declare? Thank you. Minutes. Can I ask the committee to confirm the minutes of the meeting held on 19th of September 2024 to be signed by me as a correct record? Agreed. Thank you. Summary list of actions. Can I ask the committee to note the ongoing actions arising from its previous meetings and the additional correspondence received? Thank you. Action taken under delegated authority. Can I ask the committee to note the action taken by me as chair under delegated authority following consultation with party group lead members, namely to agree the committee's letter as outlined in the agenda report? Excellent. Now to today's main item of business, a discussion on local food growing in London. Today's discussion will be split into 2 panels. I'd like to welcome our guests for this first panel. Professor Andre Fergan, Professor of Architecture, University of Brighton. Sandra Salazar, founder of Go Grow with Love, CIC. Pauline Shakespeare, Roots into Food Growing Project. Ruth Arnott, Community Gardening Coordinator, Southwark Council. And joining us remotely is Sarah Williams, Director of Programmes at the Capital Growth Network. And hopefully we'll be able to see Sarah shortly. I'm going to kick off with the first question, which is to every member of the panel. And it's just, how would you assess the current state of community food growing in London? So how would you assess the current state of community food growing in London? Could I start with you, Ruth?
Hello, can you hear me? I'd say there's a lot going on in different places at different levels, and it's very variable. We live in, I'm representing Southwark Council, so we're an inner city borough, and we obviously have a lot of land pressures and not that option for the peri-urban farms that other places within London have. In Southwark, we've got a process to support food growing on housing estates, looking at alternative land to allow groups to do community gardening and food growing projects. But we've also got the formal allotments, so there's so many different scales of food growing within the city, from small estate-based growing to larger community gardens with training options and project workers, to larger places which can offer qualifications, and then there's the peri-urban farms and city farms. There's a huge level. There's a lot going on, but it's very different across London.
Thank you. That's really helpful. Pauline, welcome. What's your assessment?
Hello. Thanks for having me today. Similar to Ruth, I think there's a very mixed picture across London. The work that I did with Roots into Food Growing was pan-London, specifically working to support black and brown food growers. Some of them were on allotment sites and struggling to hold on to those sites. So very different experiences depending on which borough people live in. There is also much bigger projects in London, such as Black Roots, who are at Wolves Lane Horticulture Centre, sharing the space with multiple different growing projects where they have a longer lease. So there is optimism, but still challenge in establishing their own growing space and their own food sovereignty. I'd say that the number of black and brown growers in paid positions on community food growing is extremely limited. There is a lot of reliance on volunteer support and goodwill from those communities to engage. Some of the research that kind of was surfaced through Roots into Food Growing was the challenge of black and brown people to actually feel welcome in community food growing spaces, and not really having the agency to become stakeholders and decision makers in those projects. And they were sort of put in the position of beneficiaries, which is a bit of a kind of lack of equity from my experience.
Thanks, that's a really helpful opening. Sandra, many of the committee, including myself, met you for the first time at a visit to Organic Lee recently, so I'm delighted that you're able to join the panel. What would you say is your assessment of community food growing? What's your assessment of what community food growing is like in London? Yeah, I noticed that too.
So my assessment, thank you for having me, yes. My assessment with regards to community food growing in London is that there is a lot of projects popping, and which is brilliant. But in terms of support, specifically projects that focused on BIPOC people, the lack of support is still minimal. I'm happy to see a lot of food growing going on in schools, so I can see that as a community food growing project as well. So we are taking initiatives to really push the food growing aspect in schools, as well as in estates, tackling and doing a lot of community engagement. So there is positive, from my view, things happen around community food growing projects in London. We just need more support, way more support. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Andre.
Hi. So community food growing in London, I would say I think it's like fairly typical of many cities, certainly in Europe. The general situation is, yeah, pretty common. I mean, community food growing is obviously only one type of urban food growing, but it's a very important part. One of the probably major challenges going across the board is how to sort of scale or replicate these projects, because they are typically quite fragile for reasons people have said. And then I think generally it's not really sort of integrated very well into thinking about how these spaces form part of a coherent green infrastructure, perhaps linked to the local nature recovery strategy, for example.
Thank you very much. And then coming over to Sarah, who's joining us remotely. Welcome, Sarah, and good morning. The first question is, how would you assess the current state of community food growing in London?
Hi, Anne. Thank you. I haven't spoken much in the last couple of days, so hopefully I can do it without a coughing fit. I've got COVID, so I suppose just reinforcing what everyone else has said, it's patchy and it's not where it could be. It used to be ahead of the curve. And it used to be coherent. So we used to have like a vision for what food growing should be across London. Now it's driven by sort of local authority or local groups that are prevalent in particular boroughs or, particular change makers rather than a sort of London-wide strategy. So my question back really would be, whose remit is it to know and even care what's happening across London? Because it used to be GLA, Mayor of London, and now that remit has definitely dropped off. There is, as it appears, no interest in what the London-wide picture is coming strongly through the Mayor. So, for example, we used to gather data sort of collectively between Capital Growth, which is the London-wide network that the Mayor supported, and the GLA. So we would be able to tell you things like the correlation between deprivation and community food growing. So we used to know that actually a lot of the community food growing was in areas of high deprivation where there was lack of access to sort of other quality green space, but now we can't tell you that. So a lot of what we tell you now, because we haven't got the resources at Capital Growth to drill into the data, is quite anecdotal, I would say. But yeah, I think we've not kept ahead of the curve, and we're at danger of sort of really slipping back to being quite a mediocre place with just some sort of beacons of good practice led by boroughs and particular champions.
Thanks, Sarah. That's quite bleak. Can I say, I'm sure on behalf of our whole committee too as well, get well soon, and thank you for joining us despite the COVID. Just to stay with you, Sarah, you recently you submitted a submission to the Environment Committee, and it highlighted a study from Brighton that identified food growing areas having 50 times more bees than other council land. Do you think we're recognising the difference this makes to biodiversity, and if not, what more could be done to highlight this biodiversity difference?
No, I mean, I think that the sort of the thing about food growing, which I've sort of said to various people in the committee and in the GLA before, is like the beauty of it is also its challenge, is that it hits so many objectives and agendas that you could give some stats on every area, but it tends to fall between the cracks because it doesn't fit nice and neatly within one department, and the way that government ends up tending to silo objectives and targets. In terms of the nature and biodiversity stuff, I think the evidence is becoming much, much stronger, and particularly, a lot of community food growers are really dedicated to biodiversity and nature engagement. It's sort of the way they want to grow really encourages that, not always, but mostly. So I think that as a collective of gardens, and particularly for Capital Growth, we've really recognised that increasingly in the last few years. There is a little signal of hope, or there was at least last year, from the environment team when they did a bit of work with us in terms of trying to recognise community food growing as part of the sort of GLA approach to their nature recovery work. And we've started to try and bring that through to our work with councils. Trying to create that thread right down from, GLA setting the agendas, local authorities, through to what's going on the ground. That work is, from our point of view, we got a couple of £1,000 to help the environment team to do that. That work has ended now, and I'm not quite sure what the next step is. I'm sure that the GLA will be continuing that. What we've found is that it's not such a joined up picture at the local authority level. So sometimes a community food growing remit sits nice and neatly with an ecologist or within a team that gets it, but sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it might be within public health or within somewhere else in the local authority. So I think that there's a lot of opportunity there to really join those two agendas together.
Thank you, Sarah, and we'll be putting those questions for GLA later on in the second half of the panel. To the 4 people in the room, so we know there's no environmental justice without racial, social and economic justice too. All of these things interconnect. We've just heard about biodiversity there. My last question, I guess, is what other benefits are there for health, climate, environmental goals of food growing? I realise this is a big question and we've got a whole committee on this, so don't feel like you need to give lots of answers, but if you're just going to give me the headlines about what other benefits there are. Ruth, should I start with you again? Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, we really recognise the health and well-being and feeling of community is a really key output for all the community growing on estates particularly, and moving away from being isolated in a community. We do an annual evaluation of the community food growers of about 70 to 80 people a year and ask them in detail what they get out of it and challenges and opportunities. Lots of people get more involved with other things where they live as a result of food growing together. They know people, they feel differently about where they live, they move towards stewardship of a place, they're interested in lots of other things. As Sarah said, I mean, we've anecdotally see evidence of people who are food growing becoming the advocates for all the other greening activities and see them as a key partner for local authority and government level delivering on other climate change actions, because there's a receptive group of people who are already doing things in their local community, and they're really a key audience, the gardening groups, food growers for all these other greening activities. And as you say, they go on to, hedges, ponds, orchards become part of food growing, and groups make partnerships, working towards green corridors, working with other local organisations. There's a lot to link up, which food growing fits really well into.
Thank you. Pauline, same question.
For me, the biodiversity question is really interesting and important to think about. It's good to know that resources are going into monitoring that. I just wish there were also resources going into monitoring Black and brown people and their access to green space. This was kind of particularly evidenced during the pandemic. The issue of green space access and what local food growing projects run by people that look like them and are part of their community can bring in terms of the real benefit of engaging with green space without having to leave London, go to the countryside. It gets them to potentially get involved in themes and issues around conservation through kind of learning more about nature in the local environment and things about how to plant food, how to grow food. So there is an element of education. And also some of the things that Ruth said in terms of reducing isolation, but some of the projects are even providing meals to volunteers, so providing a real benefit in terms of access to healthy, nutritious food that is hyper-locally grown is critical.
Thank you. And I note your report talked about systemic exclusion and systemic racism that happens when people don't have access to land. Assemblymember Mahfouz is going to be picking up on those questions later on. Sandra.
Hi. So for me, food growing, how does food growing link up to what we... So food growing, for me, is a platform that we use to link so many areas. We link housing to food growing, we link social isolation to food growing, we link education to food growing, we link, again, climate, biodiversity. And how do we do that? Well, we have a strategy that is good to start young. So implementing food growing in schools, it's really important. Food growing, climate justice, knowing that the children can have those options of learning about everyday things that relate to climate, relate to their environment, relate to their way of living, relate to their families, it's always a positive thing to do. So we do a lot of work in schools, in nurseries, you know, allowing children to pick up soil, put in their mouth, you know, learning about the biodiversity, the micro-life that's making things happen underneath the soil, so that we have houses, we have a platform called, you know, The Ground, to live, to build our homes, to grow our food, to spend time with family. So those are just essential life skills, I guess, that we work towards with and work very hard. The other aspect of how food growing links is also more work in schools when the children go on to secondary schools. Now, obviously, things have changed. Children change. Secondary school is a very important stage on one's life. So again, implementing food growing as a platform to tackle certain issues around perhaps nutrition is something really, really key. What are children eating that are supporting them in their education throughout their exams, through you know, the changes, and all the weight that they have to carry through climate, you know, what do they call it now, climate depression, you know. So that's two areas. And then there's also women, you know, particular groups. We work very closely with women. And the reason why we work very closely with women is because of issues like social isolation, no food, families don't, and households that lack food, you know, nowhere to go to perhaps even spend time with families and friends, no green spaces, you know. So we work with people in estates to create those spaces right outside their doorsteps, to create even food boxes outside their doorsteps so that they can just pick and go home and eat it, literally just there. So there are simple practices that we can put in place that later on is going to give us magnificent results. And that's what we bring to the table. So I'll pass on because I can keep going and going and going.
Love it, thank you. And we also received evidence from a Women's Environmental Network that very much echoed what you're saying. Andre.
So the question is what additional benefits there are. Well, in a way, I want to pick up a little bit, and I think what several people have been saying is that this idea of an overall strategy for the city, that does seem really missing. I brought this in with me from 2004, which links actually to what Sarah was saying. This is when the Architecture and Urbanism Unit were operating pre the Olympics, and we did a whole study with folk in the Architecture and Urbanism Unit looking at, you know, how you might integrate food-growing spaces into, in this case, it was Thames Gateway. And that kind of overall vision, although it's, of course, really challenging to implement because it raises so many questions of land ownership, etc. But that does seem to have got a bit lost. And cities like Ghent, for example, are now doing really interesting stuff. I mean, Paris, you may be aware of, has done a lot of work. But I think the big sort of idea for me that's often forgotten about food-growing spaces is how they contribute to placemaking and how they have a role in the quality of the urban environment. So, you know, thinking about how these spaces, which of course link to biodiversity, net biodiversity gain, the local nature recovery strategy, bringing those all together to kind of create this vision for what London could be, like lots of other cities. I mean, just also remember it's not exceptional, you know, it's another big city. That would be really important. And then to start working with people on the ground who are also making policy in boroughs, to understand what mechanisms could kind of enable planning policy be put in place, for example, to rethink density, for example, you know, think of density from an ecological or environmental perspective. What are the benefits from growing spaces in a city? But I think, I mean, the big point, which probably you all know, is that food growing, it doesn't have one like winning argument, one thing that says this is a fantastic thing to do. It's a collection of many parts that makes a really powerful contribution to environment, city, and people. And that's obviously one of the challenges, to communicate that. Sorry, I'll stop.
No, that's really helpful. Thank you. I'm going to open up to my colleagues in a moment just for the last question to Sarah. And Sarah, I know you could probably answer this in your sleep, so feel free to just give us the headlines. But
just to clarify, what's the additional benefits? Is that
exactly that?
Yeah. I mean, yeah, I think just building on what everyone else has said. You know, I've visited probably too many community food growing sites over my last like 20 years of doing this work. And as we say, the beauty of it is that the people that are creating these spaces and making these places are not looking at it from a health angle or an environmental angle or a community cohesion angle. They just want to do this, you know, great thing in their local area, and they don't silo it. And that's where the sort of beauty occurs. And then the policymakers want to give you a bit of money, you know, from the Environment Fund or from the health perspective, and are sort of breaking away the magic of what occurs. And I think that that's the thing. It can adapt, and it can be whatever it needs to be in a local area. And for those of you that, you know, remember the days of food growing really being championed in our city, you know, in the run up to the Olympics, and when we had sort of someone championing food, they would go and talk to, you know, Bobbies on the Beat. And the famous story is that, you know, there was a food growing space and all of a sudden people felt safer in the area and the police weren't having to patrol it as much. And just because seeing people come together positively in a space had really made the place. So I think that's the magical bit that can happen in community food growing. It, you know, and then the more you have, the more it creates a bit of a virtuous circle around what we can see. So I think, you know, it can be anything depending on where, you know, the person leading or the funder leading the project wants it to go. But to be able to give it the space to do what it needs to do and to not try and pin it down to key agendas would be the magical way for the GLA to sort of go, really.
Can I ask briefly, Sarah, I mean, the food is plant-based by nature. What evidence or data is there around the benefits for people's health in terms of the food they're eating?
I mean, I think that a lot of the measuring that sort of in a really scientific way is quite difficult. But I think, I mean, the biggest health benefit is clearly mental health and well-being. But I think it gives people the agency to do that. I mean, I'm sure that there is evidence. Andre, you might be better player. I don't know, because you're obviously not doing the health stuff, but I'm sure there is evidence around the health benefits. It's about access to food. You know, what you eat and how you eat it is it's a very complicated picture. But there's no doubt that giving people access to grow their own food improves their health, if that makes sense. So, you know, whether that's directly correlated to diet, yeah, I'd have to double check on that.
That's helpful. Thank you. I'm going to hand over to Assembly Member McCartney.
Thank you. I'm going to ask initially about London's local nature recovery strategy, which is in its early stages. But Professor, you said earlier that food growing could play a part of any nature recovery strategy. Can you ask us how food growing could play a part in that? And I'm going to ask all of you. But also, have you had a chance yet to engage with the initial phases of this work?
So in relation to the local nature recovery strategy, well, I think there's one of the things I found really interesting is that there's at least conceptually a very simple way. So you have an interactive map where people are indicating green spaces that could be connected up within London, which reminds me very much of the green grid, which was being discussed in the early 2000s as well, which is trying to link up green spaces in the city. Now, this idea of green corridors in the city is one that several of us have been arguing for years should be part of a coherent way of introducing food growing spaces into a green grid. Oh, we have different words for it. Continuous productive urban landscape is one word. But what I would have thought would be a really interesting thing to consider is if the intention is to build these green corridors, then of course there are lots of questions about land ownership, how you establish them, etc., etc. But one mechanism which could be looked at is, for example, net biodiversity gain now being a requirement for development. Perhaps there could be a relationship between the biodiversity gain happening within these corridors, and so this could, start constructing these green sort of biodiverse ecological corridors. Of course, that assumes you are using a kind of agroecological approach, and in other places there may be other types of urban agriculture are appropriate. But in relation to the local nature recovery strategy, it seems to me you've got it sitting in front of you. There's that map. It shows all these corridors. Why wouldn't they include productive spaces as well as other activities? So I think there's fantastic potential, and especially if you think about things like net biodiversity gain, et cetera, et cetera.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. Sandra, can I come to you? That's the same question.
Yes, so I feel there's definitely things in the London food, you're talking about the London food strategy.
The GLA is consulting at the moment about London's local nature recovery strategy. I'm just wondering how food growing could fit into that, and if you've been engaged in that process so far.
So definitely by creating spaces where people can grow food outside their homes, or that would definitely have a positive impact in what they put into their bodies, into their families' bodies, which therefore will have a positive impact on their health and well-being. Also, the mental state of practicing gardening or practicing food growing it's something that definitely should be more embraced and more practiced by everybody, and that's because of how good it makes you feel. And that, generates a positive energy and a positive outlook and solutions. So I do feel like food growing is definitely an excellent platform that is full of solution-based practices that we can put in place, and we can do this by just doing simple things. It doesn't have to be a major challenge. Like Professor Andre said, we are all doing our things individually. Actually collecting all of that and put it together, we will see the bigger picture. Food growing could definitely make that happen.
Okay, thank you. And I'm going to come to Pauline next. Yes, have you engaged with the London local nature recovery strategy, and how could food growing play a part?
I'm not engaged with the strategy.
Yeah.
I'm not part of any consultations apart from being here today. It's interesting to me how things are still relatively fragmented, that we kind of put biodiversity over here, food over here, nature somewhere over here, planning and green corridors over here, and it's how can officers in local authorities think more holistically about what is going on in cities, I think is the mindset shift that maybe we need to look towards. I was lucky enough last year to go to Philadelphia and meet officers who are working on a plan called Growing from the Root, which is an agroecological plan for the whole city of Philadelphia. This includes the Parks Department's planning legislation to open up spaces. It looks at waterways, keeping of animals, the kind of historic mapping of food deserts, public health, and involves local authority officers in making the shift to enable third sector organisations such as Sandra's, who don't have the capacity to move levers of planning or public policy to be able to be part of the difference. So in a way, I'd kind of turn it back and think, how can the government look differently at this?
Yeah, thank you. Ruth, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think I agree. I think I think it's really important. I suppose it's following on from what everyone's said, that it should be a standalone thing. It's fitting it into all these other things just because that's the current topic is just too short term. And we're lucky enough at Southwark to have one role, an officer role, which is Community Gardening Coordinator, which is their job share. And I think having people who come from a background of food growing, community gardening and working in these kind of projects, working either as council officers or as another organisation working with the council is really key to understanding all the issues, because it is complicated and there's a lot of things to consider. But holding that space, and we're lucky enough we've got a permanent role now, is somewhere to move on and develop from. We're in the ecology team in our position in parks, so we're working closely with our colleagues there to fit together what we're doing. And we've got, like I said before, the gardening groups and food growing groups on estates becoming, all the work that they do aligns with all this kind of stuff about the green corridors. We've got a great example in Camberwell of a estate gardening group who work with a local organisation, Southwark Nature Action Volunteers, who apply for funding to do to make a green corridor from 2 parks using the estate. There's lots of examples of that. So yeah, I think it's trying to carve out space of the how to do this stuff now.
And do you think you're doing it well in Southwark? Do you think you're making
I think we've got a good start, but we need more capacity. I mean, it's capacity for all the different levels. I think capacity, for volunteers and all the organisations, and the security of funding for them to do their work when they've got years of evidence that it's really beneficial. But then within the council capacity, for the long-term strategic, how is this going to feed into all these other topics? I think that's a real opportunity here, what the GLA could do. And there are some really good examples of other funds. There's one called Nature Towns and Cities, I think, that's just been set up by the National Trust and the national government and the National Lottery to provide capacity for developing partnerships between local authorities and other big organisations to just have that time to do really good long-term planning and including everyone in the conversation. I think it's the long-term, that's where we need some direction.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. I'm going to come to Sarah. I don't know if you've got anything to add on top of that.
Yes, definitely. We've very much been engaged with the GLA London, the local nature recovery strategy. So we've worked closely with the Green Infrastructure team from January to, I think, May time, and we produced a report. So we, and apologies to anyone on the panel who didn't get the 7 emails sent out to our network about filling that in for your sites, but we did really we got about 150 responses that told us exactly how food growing sites can contribute towards nature recovery. So that's from the sort of habitats they've got to the monitoring of species. What we found was that a lot of food growing gardens currently aren't really doing the surveys and the monitoring of what species are on their site, which we know is really helpful data in tracking sort of baselines and improvements. So we were so excited by the potential that we actually shaped our latest bid to the City Bridge Foundation for capital growth all around the nature recovery work, including some areas like nature champions and how to increase the sort of monitoring, as well as obviously increasing the number of sites. We haven't heard back because City Bridge Foundation, I don't know if you know, as a key funder for London, have totally rejigged the amount that they'll fund and who they're funding. So we've had a delayed decision. And we've also asked the GLA 3 separate departments to provide some match funding towards that, and we've had a no from all of those departments. We've also been told, as a bit of a side grumble, that the budgets still haven't been set for this year, but maybe that's a different committee that will be looking at that. So we're in October and this year's budgets still haven't been set. So hey ho. But yeah, I think that the nature, as I was sort of alluded to earlier, I think the nature recovery stuff does offer a really exciting link with food growing to see, because it's about the way that people grow, the organic nature of which people grow, and how they can be contributing back towards that sort of that the wildlife element of it. I think is really exciting, and we found a lot of enthusiasm and excitement from the groups that we've engaged with. The other area just to look at in terms of is the peri-urban and what role there could be for sort of larger areas of agroecology, sort of community agroecology, and how they could bring in the sort of wildlife agenda alongside a sort of productive farming. I think that needs a lot more exploration, but again, I think that could be a really key part of a nature recovery strategy. And I know it is something that the Green Infrastructure team have endeavoured to look at, but engaging, there's only about, I think it's about 200 farms registered in London, but they're actually really difficult to engage with. So it takes a bit more work.
Thank you. And then just sticking with you, my second question was about funding, because the committee wrote following our last meeting and asked for some certainty over the funding. And you're saying you have none as yet.
No, I've been chasing my tail, running around trying to get answers from different departments. Health not interested. Green Infrastructure said they haven't got that sort, they just haven't got the freedom to make those decisions. And I think there's been some exploration of the skills remit as well. So, and there's no sort of cross-cutting budget on food at the moment, as far as I'm aware. So yeah, we've just had a thanks. We sort of appreciate all the work you do, but there's not any money for you. And then we're only asking for quite a small amount at the moment. So at the moment, Capital Growth hasn't got any funding, and we're running on some sort of central reserve money that we've got until we get the outcome of the City Bridge Foundation bid. So yeah, it's in terms of that London-wide view, that's why I was saying earlier on, whose responsibility and whose remit is it? Because Capital Growth might not be here to give the data and to give these answers for much longer. So I think someone within the GLA needs to take a bit of ownership if they're serious about this agenda.
Okay, well, we have some of them coming in shortly, so I'm sure the questions will be asked. Can I just stick with you, though, if I can, Sarah? Because your Good Food Local report identifies a range of engagement in food growing across London boroughs, and obviously different boroughs do things differently. Can you highlight any examples of good practice that you would like to draw our attention to? And what, I suppose, are the key bits of advice you would give any borough wanting to embark on improving their food growing activity?
Yeah, I mean, you've got one of them in the room, which is Southwark. I mean, the way that Southwark have approached their sort of, grassroots, so they've been able to give a framework for food growing, but enable people a grassroots approach to it, if that makes sense. So it's like, if there are enough people interested and you've identified a space, sorry, Ruth, you should probably be talking to this, not me, then you can come forward and you can put a proposal and you can access that land. And it's very much around, initially around sort of housing estates and often those lost bits of land that occur. So I think giving that structure, making it really clear for residents how they do it. One of the biggest things that we hear is it's just a bit of a quagmire of how you access land, who you go to in the council, whose remit is. So one of the things that we do through the Good Food for All Londoners report is we try and set out what the sort of basic standard is that local authorities should be doing in order to make it easier for people to grow food in their boroughs. And one of those is having a named person, having some resources that can go into it. So I think that's really, really important. I mean, we put some more examples into our submission, but I think we talked a bit about Camden and all of the planning policies that they've got in place. and how good those are for sort of creating, again, a framework so that people that can grow. We also cited some work that's been going on in one of the sort of newest kids on the block, I suppose, which is in Hounslow, where they've managed to get shared prosperity funding to take a sort of borough-wide approach to increasing and improving food growing across the borough. So, and the other one, I suppose, that I would refer to is Kensington and Chelsea, who for a long time have been they say repurposed lots of old tennis courts that existed across the borough, particularly in the sort of half of the borough that's more deprived, and turned those into a series of kitchen gardens where people can get access to sort of smaller plots. So that's again been, so there's lots of these examples of really sort of successful approaches that councils have taken. One of the things that Capital Growth has tried to do is to sort of join all those council officers together, so you know they can all learn from what each other's doing and try and raise the standard across all of the boroughs, so they're not just doing one thing in one place, but they're all slowly building on that good practice, because local authorities have got such an opportunity. The one last thing I'll just do is, and this might come up another question, is to take the opportunity to plug this idea of a right to grow, or a community right to grow, or some places have called it a license to grow. We've seen, we've been working closely with Incredible Edible, whose sort of idea this was, and we're seeing it really taking off in the north, and some of the councils in the north, and they're doing some work across four metro authorities in the north to sort of really see how they can push this concept through. It feels like London is ripe for that, and we could be sort of putting ourselves at the sort of forefront of this approach to, I suppose the idea is, you know, you're turning the, sorry, my brain's a bit foggy, but you're turning the sort of attitude from, oh, I really need to beg for permission to grow food, to saying, you're going to be given permission to grow food unless there's a good reason that you shouldn't grow food there. So I think it's really just turning the pivot on that. And I think local authorities and the Mayor of London have got a real opportunity to drive that agenda forward.
Thank you. Can I just come to our remaining guest? Does anything have anything to add about how perhaps councils and the Mayor, what they could do to make sure that food growing doesn't sort of fall between the cracks and it's just more streamlined and easier to take place? Yeah.
So, for instance, allotments are a big part of the historical food growing in the UK, and we see in London we have a lot of allotments, but allotments also need support. A lot of our elders allotments are intergenerational, they're multicultural, they are a base for training as well, food growing training, because it's not just about growing food, it's about growing food the right way. How can we grow food and support, say, biodiversity, support microlife? So, you know, so it's a unit that has a lot of strands to it. But I feel in my line of work, allotments are also this new opportunity. As the elders kind of draw back the young people, there's a new energy of young people who are now trying to access allotments because of the lack of green spaces in London, and where can they grow food? So, for example, we have a huge allotment in Enfield, Falcon Fields, which has over 260 plot holders. It's huge. What are we doing to support those patches of green spaces that are still available? So that's my question there also. How can we work with the people? Because community engagement is so important. We can say that, you know, we have amazing organizations that are doing amazing work and putting data together, but nothing beats actually going to the ground and talking to the people and asking them, what do you want to see happen? And that's what we do. We are there every single day talking to the people, shaping things to ensure that these people are getting good foods and they're getting the training necessary. Perhaps because we're there. So in the essence, we are taking that responsibility and the role of GLA to make sure that our people are growing food and they're helping and doing those kind of things.
Okay. Does anybody else want to add anything? Pauline?
I would just add to Sandra's comments. How can people like Sandra be better supported? They're already doing the community engagement work. They have deep roots and trusted relationships with community members. What can be done to support those organisations that don't have core funding? They don't have secure access to land or any term or long-term tenancy. They're constantly battling with local authorities not to actually be thrown off the land, which brings about a great insecurity to those projects and disrupts their work on a regular basis. It means that you don't get the sustained long-term action that you need to be part of these kind of policy-driven actions. I'd also add, just again, to go back to challenging all of this slightly and thinking, can we look at this in a bit more of a holistic way? I guess the word that no one's chucked in yet is polycrisis, and food very much fits into this. We saw during the pandemic how access to food, access to fresh food, access to nature, access to green space, and all of the impact on mental health are kind of vital to making us work, but also making our economy work. We can't thrive without those fundamental things, so we shouldn't be dilly-dallying about why they're critical. I'd also, there's one more thing. Some of the work that I have seen across London has actually been supported not by local government, but actually by trusts and foundations who are looking at this and using tools and methods and kind of frameworks around transformation to look at projects. So I would point to the Joseph Rowntree Foundation and their Emerging Futures programme, which is supporting really important initiatives like the Black Farmers Market, which has held a number of Black Farmers Market events in the Brixton area, but next to Brixton Station. Really successful in terms of footfall, in terms of what they brought to the area, but incredibly challenged in terms of the basics of trying to work with the local authority to actually make a market happen, to get access to the stalls, to kind of cleaning, all of the basic things that are acting as barriers to micro startups trying to do amazing things around access to food and bringing people into and animating local areas. I'd also point to the guys in St Thomas's Trust and the Impact on Urban Health Unit. Obviously, their work is restricted by geography, but the Black Food Fund that they set up, which is based on principles of public health, but also about trying to better understand local food systems and connect people. There's really exciting work going on that is beyond the people in the room, and other people are supporting and engaging. Thank you.
Thank you. And then, Ruth, you've been cited as an example of good practice. Is there anything extra that has really made a difference in Southwark? Apart from yourself, of course.
Say that last bit again, sorry.
Is there anything extra that hasn't been mentioned that has really made a difference?
Yeah, I think that there's a few things to mention. I suppose our approach in Southwark, we came out of a temporary role to begin with, and we had funding to support the setting up of new projects, specifically on estates, where there was a desire to do so. And when the role became permanent, we've got the opportunity to move into more, the process was there, and it hopefully is a transparent process. People know how they can do that now, and that was what Sarah was highlighting. Having a clear way that people can set up food growing projects is really important. But the other side of the work we do is network supporting. I suppose that we recognise that just building new projects, supporting groups to build new projects is one thing, but there's a lot of existing projects who are struggling or going through different incarnations of, struggling with volunteers and all those kinds of stuff. So the other part of the role we offer is to support a network there are some existing local networks. We find it really important to do engagement twice a year, listening events, invite everyone, people who are growing on formal allotments as well, to come along and hear about opportunities and problems that they have and things that we in the council can then support with. But then it's also building their capacity to do things as a collective as well, and sort of developing that relationship of a partnership working rather than being opposed to each other. There's a lot of opportunity for that further. In Southwark, we've just had the Southwark Environment Scrutiny Commission support a right to grow just on Monday evening, and they're recommending that to go to the Cabinet for them to discuss. So that's quite a key development in Southwark. It really fits in also with the Southwark Land Commission, which is...
Yeah, I think there's going to be some further questions on that shortly, so I'm not going to tread on that. So I suspect we've got a range of questions for you on your thing, so I'll probably leave it there, Chair, if that's...
Thank you. We are going to move to land and planning, so Assembly Member Roberts.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm just conscious of time, so I won't be asking questions of all the panel, because yes, so apologise if I don't ask everybody. Professor, let me see, where are we? So, what are the key findings of your research about the best ways to incorporate food-growing spaces into cities?
I'm just wondering what you mean by ways. But, I mean, what we would say, well, what we developed briefly was an idea called in this case, Continuous Productive Urban Landscape sort of action plan, which just talks about 4 steps, which in a way or 4 actions that need to all happen together to implement spaces like this. So one is, and we've been talking a lot about these top-down and bottom-up initiatives being brought together. One, actually doing a lot of mapping work, not just to see how much space there is, but actually what capacities there are to support food growing and food growing businesses. So it's not only space, of course, it's people who have the skills to grow, who can make business plans, who can see how these projects can work. The other is actually just visualizing what this kind of infrastructure would look like, because often if you talk to people who aren't aware of what a green corridor might be like or what green infrastructure is, if you say food growing, especially in the UK context, people just think about allotments, and they also often think the idea is that everybody has to become self-sufficient and grow their own food, which has never been the idea. I mean, some people want to grow food, some people don't, some people are good at it, some aren't. So making this kind of vision again for how the system would work and actually what it would look like and what it would be like to experience is really important. So that was the third. So it was top-down, bottom-up. We called it inventories of urban capacity, working out what's there, what's missing, visualizing this as a system and also as something you can experience. And then, obviously, the idea of constant sort of research and iteration, which is, I think, also what we're seeing here, how projects evolve, what works, what doesn't. So having those kind of 4 things in place is really important. And if you look at examples of places where food growing has really been integrated, either like in crisis, say in Cuba after the collapse of the Soviet Union, they transformed their commercial farming infrastructure into an infrastructure that would support people who wanted to become farmers, and they found land and all that. So an infrastructure that works. Contemporary European cities are doing much more work about developing appropriate infrastructure. I'm saying like Ghent in Brussels, there are interesting projects. So, yeah, having both the sort of overall vision and then an infrastructure to support it, to support people who want to engage with it is really important. And I think one thing that just came quite interesting when I was looking at the London Food Strategy, the 2023 one, actually the projects that are quoted in that as some examples of urban agriculture or organically growing communities, various ones. Actually, interestingly, those are all the ones that did start or had been started in the early 2000s. At this time, actually, Sarah was talking about where, there seemed to be a much clearer strategy about food being part of the way forward. So, yeah, a kind of coordinated approach. And I think what is interesting to flag up, which you may all be aware of, but an organization, international, well, pan-European organization called the European Forum for Urban Agriculture has just launched a manifesto at the end of a 3 or 4 year program in Europe looking at all the things we're looking at. And that tries to bring together a kind of a toolkit for what could be done. And it also has this manifesto, which in this case asks the EU, so what could you do to support urban food growing? So it's the same question we're asking here, and the answers are not dissimilar, but that information is, or that resource, is probably an interesting one to look at. And one of the challenges is that, a lot of the evidence is still quite anecdotal. Mm-hmm. So there's not a lot of collection of metrics. And I think the other thing is they talk about in that sharing information. And in a way, it seems to me what might be a useful way to find some sort of agency within London is that, okay, if the mayor doesn't have land that he can convert into farms, but maybe they could convene some really useful kind of workshops with policymakers, with people on the ground who can share information and can learn from each other. And ditto, for example, connecting with some of these other European cities where things are happening to share information and to learn. Because I think the one thing we learned early on in our work was wherever you went, people thought the center was somewhere else. In the 2000s, you'd go to Cuba and they'd say, oh, but we've heard this is happening in London or something. Or you'd go to Toronto and they'd say, oh, yeah, but there's this project in New York. And actually, all the places are trying to do similar things, and they're generally suffering from fairly common problems. So, but I think the big thing we can see is that the understanding of the importance of food and green infrastructure, that has moved on. I mean, in 2000, when you spoke about urban agriculture in London, or anywhere in the UK, the response would be, oh, yeah, so interesting. That's an interesting idea. Now it's taken much more seriously and people kind of understand the benefits. But yeah, I think convening actually a really useful sort of gathering of people who actually have experience alongside trying to develop a framework that could support it, and a vision, if you want that word, or scenario building, is really important. And we did have that before, 20 years ago in London, an attempt to do that. And it's interesting just sitting here to kind of feel how actually that has got a bit lost.
Okay, thank you very much. That's very interesting. Thank you. I'm going to turn now to Ruth. So how did the Southwark Lands Commission inform the Council's approach to allocating land for food growing?
We began in our role before the Land Commission, actually. So we had a process, the Allotment Expansion Guarantee is what it's called, that launched in 2021. And the Land Commission was last year, 23. The Land Commission is like a framework which has a lot of synergy with Right to Grow, in that the Council is leading the conversation to bring in all the anchor institutions and larger landowners within the borough to come together and think about how to free up land for public use and balance that decision-making between what are the benefits for the public and what are the needs. And obviously, housing is very pressing in Southwark, and it's the largest social landlord in London. But yeah, it's just starting to get actioned. The Land Commission, the councillors did a report, and the first steps are beginning to happen, and one of those is having regular meetings with all these larger landowners and moving towards working together. The council response to the Land Commission report in July this year supported the further development of food growing and community gardening, and on the back of this, projects can be developed, and they've identified neighbourhood community infrastructure levy sale money might be the right mechanism to fund a lot of these projects. So that's if the individual ward councillors see that as a priority.
Excellent. And I think you mentioned that you've got 2 people. Sorry, I should talk. You want to talk to here, but the microphone's over here, and we've got people at home who may well be listening in. You said you've got 2 people on JobShare currently working as the coordinators. Do you have any idea of how many people they're interacting, how many residents, possibly businesses, they're interacting with on a, say, monthly basis? And do they have KPIs and things to hit? And if they do, what are they?
Yeah, that's me.
Okay.
My JobShare here. Yeah, yeah, we do. For numbers of people we interact with, I haven't got that off the top of my head, but we.
Is the phone ringing off the hook, or is it sort of more niche? We
have different. We are the main point of contact for any community gardening or food growing queries to the council. So we get a lot of different types of inquiries. Some of those will be people who are trying to identify a piece of land, who owns it. A lot is supporting existing groups. We do a lot of training and events to support a network. We don't have a huge amount of funding to deliver new projects currently. So that was the first part of our work, where we advertised this a bit more, that we were looking for, this was an opportunity. So we have a slower stream of groups coming to us because they find out through different networks in the borough that this, if there's 5 or more people who want to set up a project on an estate, then they come to us and we go through the process that we've developed, site checks, group development, support, consultation, and then help the group fundraise for that project. And we also continue to support them afterwards with mapping projects and invite them to our training and events, and they become part of a network. We do a lot of community organising training and communications training, because we recognise these are skills that will really enable people who might traditionally not be those who step forward to set up a project to get more involved and hopefully become more accessible.
Excellent. And roughly, what sorts of timescales we're looking at? So a group comes to you and says, hello, we'd like to do some growing here on this particular piece of land. How long is it roughly, on average, between the first approach and spades in the ground?
I'd say on average 1 year.
A year, excellent.
Yep. There's very variable situations,
course.
But yep, on housing estates, all the projects are unique, and they're very much led by what people want to do, where they live. Some people want to grow together. Some people want to have individual plots and communal plots. Some have other groups, like school groups that might come from a local school and have a plot. So it's very much led by what people want to do. And scales are different as well, depending on other uses of the land on that estate.
And one final question is, what's roughly the retention rate? Do you find that once something's been set up, then people are absolutely gangbusters and it just continues? Or is there a certain amount of enthusiasm fatigue that kicks in?
Well, that's one issue we recognise from working in this sector for more than a decade, is that that's why we have the process whereby we ask 5 or more people at the beginning. We really focus on talking to the group initially. How much time do you have? What are your expectations? And we guide them through this, how to reach out to get more people involved. We're really interested in sustainable groups and sustainable projects. That's why we do the training. That's why they become part of the network. There's a lot more to it than just setting up a space and expecting it all to happen. It's complicated and complex, and things change and there'll be problems, but as a permanent resource in the council now, we can be helpful in those other situations 10 years down the line where there's arguments and things have gone wrong. You know, that can happen, and we can offer mediation training or just ourselves as a resource to come and talk to groups and help them through that if that's what they would like.
Excellent. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Assemblymember Tyrrell.
Thank you, Chair. Picking up from Assemblymember Roberts' question, this one's just to Sarah to begin with, which is, can you provide examples of other local authorities that prioritise food growing initiatives?
Not wanting to take up time unnecessarily, I feel like I probably have given a few other examples already, but do you want me to go into detail on that? So I mentioned earlier Kensington and Chelsea, who have a whole programme, and again a funded officer who works to support a programme of kitchen gardens across the borough with quite large engagement. We have the approach I also mentioned before, which Hounslow are taking, levering in shared prosperity funding. Other examples are places like Waltham Forest. Waltham Forest tend to put a lot of their focus on, they've got a huge amount of allotments. So they do quite a big programme with regards to their allotments, but they also have a number of community food grain sites, and they work quite closely with Organic Lee, who are the peri-urban farm in the borough that's on the old horticultural site, and they support organically to do various sort of bits of outreach within the local area. I would say historically Tower Hamlets did quite a lot to support Women's Environment Network WEN to run the sort of food growing network for the borough, although I think their support for WEN might have dwindled over recent years, but I might be wrong. I'm not so in touch with that. So that's just a few examples. You've got one of the interesting things I think Ruth was mentioning was this idea of like the network within the local area and how important that is for the capacity building within community food growing projects. And I think that some councils are really progressive and are running that themselves, like Southwark, or seeing where there's an opportunity to support a third sector organisations to run that. So, for example, in Lambeth, you've got Incredible Edible Lambeth, who I think they've got about 150 projects within the borough registered with them. So, as I say, there are some sort of examples of places doing really well. Some places trying to kick things off and get things going. Some places doing things like focusing on schools. So I think Barking and Dagenham recently have been really focusing on supporting school-based food growing. Is that enough? Do you want more examples of?
No, that's good. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. I mean, great. You know, I suppose that the point that I would make across all of that is this: how do we get a sort of? I think the GLA and the Mayor of London's role is to really put the spotlight on local authorities and what they're doing, and trying to raise the bar across the board, so that we've got a minimum standard, and that you haven't got this postcode lottery across London, and that you are seeing London as the sort of, you know, a whole joined up approach to food growing, rather than it be dependent on where you are and what your borough thinks of it and that sort of thing. So, yeah.
Excellent. Thank you for that. So throwing this one out to all the panel, start with Ruth and we'll move across, which is how would you assess the impact of the London plan? Also, I've moved on to Keith's question. Sorry. Do you think there's sorry? Look at the wrong part of my page. Do you think there is scope to practically implement a London right to grow policy across all of London?
Yes. Yeah, I think we're down to how things can work, and that's a lot about giving confidence on both sides to landowners or custodians and groups. It's a balance, and it's like a working together situation rather than being against each other. I think we feel in Southwark that we are delivering on quite a few of the right to grow asks currently, albeit at maybe not the highest scale we could do it at, but we have a process, we have officer support, we're trying to enable people who want to set up projects to do so. I think I would encourage other local authorities to either do their own land commission or to learn from Southwark's or Liverpool's or Scotland's. I think there's a lot of potential for cross-council working on this, particularly maybe thinking about how councils with similar situations like inner city or different areas and different political makeups working together a bit more rather than trying to reinvent the wheel. It's really important to have sustain and capital growth as holding this together and bringing people together and being able to signpost different councils to each other. But that could potentially go further, I think. You know, there's other services that are cross-borough. It could be sharing officers, it could be sharing strategies. I think it's been alluded to, but some councils directly run the formal allotments, traditional allotments themselves, and have an allotment officer. In Southwark, those are all run by voluntary associations, so they're not managed directly by the council. So that's why we're focusing on opening up other land on housing, which seemed like the best place to start. I mean, there's so much more to do. But also, it's sharing, if you get all the major anchor institutions and landowners together to work together with leases, and it's building confidence of how to make this happen. And I think it's possible. I think there's lots to learn from, but maybe it's working more collectively rather than isolation. Building capacity to do that is obviously really important. Thank you.
I'd agree with a lot of what Ruth said. I think there's also a slight thing in these situations, though, that those who have the privilege and the knowledge of the system will always ask loudest first. So what can organisations do to make sure that other people are part of the conversation around right to grow? Which then goes back to, do we have the capacity to reach out to organisations who are not yet part of this conversation? The right to grow also assumes a sense of permanence in terms of where you're located. 20 years ago, that would have been different. People move around a hell of a lot, especially people who are more and more vulnerable. In London, as we know, there are barriers to people being able to stay in the same place and actually be part of a growing project. Projects are not just about people having a lack of will to stay engaged, but literally circumstances are preventing them from having a longer term engagement with a project. I think it's important just to say that.
Can you repeat the question from you again, please?
Sorry, make sure I read the right one this time. Do you think there is scope to practically implement a right to grow for communities in London?
Say that again, I can't hear properly.
Yeah. Do you think there is a scope to practically implement a right to grow for communities in London?
Do I think there's a scope to practically grow? Yes.
Sorry, Sandra, are you okay to point the microphone just nearer to your mouth? Perfect.
Yeah, perfect, thank you. Yes, I think there is a scope. I think it's all about securing land as well. It really impacts on the ability to make long-term plans. So land accessibility is so key. Again, and we do try to, even in schools, because they have land, some of the schools have land and is accessible, and we may be able to do longevity there. But then that's tackling one group of people, children and parents. In estates, rooftop gardens maybe as well. Some estates have beds that are already there, so maybe we can implement some food growing on those and hope for longevity. So a lot of it is access to land. We can say a lot of things, but it's really access to land,
Yeah, thank you.
Right. So, I mean, to answer the question, the right to grow, there's certainly land available, even though London's losing lots of land, I mean, very rapidly. But so, yeah, it could be implemented. But I think the big thing is that it needs support. It needs a strategy, and you have to be careful about it. If it turned into the idea like, okay, this is an easy way to solve the problem, you just say right to grow, you can grow wherever you like, you can foresee the problems that would happen if it's not structured and managed in a useful way because of, for example, fatigue and enthusiasm, etc., waning, and then you could easily have the situation where a site is set up, people run it for a month or so, everybody realizes they're not really growers, and then it becomes derelict. Now, it could, of course, be fantastically biodiverse in that situation, but it could also run into the problems just like the walkable city, has, where these sites become seen as eyesores by some people, and then it undermines the whole project. So I think you have to really, that's why actually an overall view for how this works is really important. And I think, again, also linking it to things like the circular economy. I mean, food growing, biodiversity, all of this is part of the circular economy. And in a way, to go back to a slightly earlier question about other places, I mean, Brighton and Hove are trying to do that. So the food strategy being developed in Brighton and Hove is also part of the circular economy strategy. They also have something which has been really useful called a planning advisory note, really describing how food growing spaces can be integrated into systems. However, it lacks the planning sort of policy underneath that to mandate this. So I think for sure this is a good idea. It can be done, but it needs to be done thoughtfully with a long-term view, and especially tenure is really important in these situations.
Thank you. Do you have anything to add, Sarah?
Yeah, and Andre, I don't know how aware you are of the work that Incredible Edible have been progressing in the North in terms of the right to grow. I think, yes, it definitely can. I think it would be a really good opportunity to put London back at the forefront of sort of pushing the envelope of what happens and how people engage and access land for food growing and engage with communities and community need. They've had it already adopted in 3 places in the North, as I mentioned earlier. They're working with Sheffield University on a knowledge exchange project to explore all of those things that Andre's, that this isn't just a catchy phrase that you just then abandon and leave people to work it out themselves. This is a whole process of how you make it meaningful. I think in Runnymede, they've already had a doubling of applications to access land. So they're already seeing a real world change from having a sort of overarching policy. I think Edinburgh are looking at adopting something like this. So another key city looking at it. We are firing ahead with Incredible Edible. We Capital Growth see this as a really big opportunity. What we're looking for is 4 London boroughs that are willing to test out the approach over the next year. We'd really like GLA mayoral support with this idea, looking at how it works in practice and then seeing if we can then set a vision for how sort of it could be adopted as a sort of mayoral commitment to encourage other boroughs to sign up. A little bit like those of you who will remember the original days of Capital Growth, where we encouraged all of the boroughs to actually sign up to a target for new growing spaces. So yes, I think it is, and I think we've got a sort of half of a workable plan. We're just putting together the rest of the plan, so we're more than happy to follow up with any of you on the sort of the detail of that.
Thank you for that, Sarah. And then this final question just to Ruth, which is just to get a bit more of an understanding about how you balance the right to grow for communities in London with other land-intensive projects like housing.
You have to have a clear criteria process where checks are done. I'm just going for a very small example of on an estate the checks, if a group comes to us and says we would like to do a growing project here, once there's a group together, we will go and meet them and look around the opportunities on the estate at the different sites and assess their suitability from a horticultural point of view, sunlight, access to water. And then it's looking at what other uses there are for that site. It's checking whether there's any plans for new homes or there's any works to go on that might use that site as a building site. You know, there's lots of checks to do. And then it's about doing consultation and widening the group and bringing everyone together. I'd see it as there's going to be clear processes and checks that take into account everything else, and it's about land being suitable, it not being on a main road. There's lots of things that would not make it suitable for food growing, and if something else is planned there, then that would be a decision to balance way up. When it's using a sensible approach to evaluate each proposal, and that being an option that can be explored, and the landowner, whoever that might be in the borough, it might not be the local authority, having a process through which people can come and apply for this bit of land, and agreeing leases, conditions, how is it going to work, having maintenance agreements, a governance agreement. These are all parts of our new projects that we develop, and we give these templates to other projects on different types of land, such as housing associations, because maintenance is a really big issue. Who's going to be responsible for what? Are you fundraising? I mean, it's just all got to be thought through, obviously. So there's got to be a lot of expertise and thinking stuff through. So I think it's not a simple thing. It's a catchy phrase, but it's something that is possible, definitely, in my opinion.
Thank you. That's all from me, Chair.
Thank you. Assembly-member Prince with a mystery question.
Mystery question, yeah. Well, it's not much of a mystery, is it? He's blew most of it. If I could start with Sarah, please. How would you assess the impact of the London Plan Policy G8, which aims to protect and support food growing and encourage the identification of new sites? Are you familiar with that?
Yeah, I'm familiar with it. How would I assess if it's been an effective policy? Is that what you're asking?
Pretty much, yeah.
I mean, we find it, I don't know if, I haven't got data, as I sort of mentioned before, that's sort of, you know, if you want sort of hard, robust data on the number of growing spaces, if we're going up, if we're going down, I would feel sort of a little bit like, you know, I'm not making it up, I've got a sort of sense of it, but I haven't got hard data to hand on it. I would say at the moment, so I find it useful to have that policy in place because it's something that we can then draw down to local authorities to talk about how they implement that from a local plan point of view and prioritising spaces. And we've had some examples where we've been asked to write some evidence to protect some growing spaces that are going to be lost, either to development or to other activity. And we often signpost people to those policies to say, look, this is of significance, you know, importance across London. So we use that policy. I think the level to which it is implemented and is used, I think depends. And I think there's no, as far as I'm aware, there's no one really policing a lot of these policies. For example, I know, you know, places like Brighton had really good SPGs, but I don't know if they were always being implemented.
Can I just ask the supplementary question to this? Because it's where you're going anyway, so we might as well kill two birds
go for it.
One stone. What would you suggest, or what could you suggest to strengthen the policy? Because I think you were just like saying some of the weaknesses in the policy. Could you make any suggestions on how we could strengthen the policy, please?
Yeah, I mean, I sort of, I'm not a planning expert, so, you know, you have to excuse my ignorance, and I don't know, you know, I assume some of you are better placed, but I think something around a target for local authorities. So there is a target of either sort of how much land, whether that's the number of sites or the amount of collective land or the distance to which each person should be able to go, I know, should every person be able to access a community food growing space within a sort of 15-20 minute walk, that sort of idea. I think something that actually puts it into some sort of metric that you could then measure would be really useful for us anyway, because then when we do our annual survey of all of the local authorities, we could ask for evidence of that. I think some sort of incorporation of something like the right to grow or a license to grow, if that is possible, would be really good. I mean, I think there's a whole suite of other things that could come into the document around sort of larger peri-urban scale sites, which isn't there at the moment. I know we've had some initial discussions with the planning team about what opportunities there might be because I think that's a really missed area of opportunity, is the sort of growing at scale, the agroecological farming on the outskirts of London. So I think there's some opportunity to maybe look at, I think it's called, I can't remember what the acronym stands for, but it's best, let me see if I can find it. It's called Best and Most Versatile Land. So it's a classification of agricultural land and is referred to in the national planning frameworks. So that should be avoided for development and should be prioritised for things like agroecology. So that's something that definitely could ramp up the London plan. Also, just prioritising areas for biodiversity net gain and identifying sites for community agroecology and the infrastructure that they need would be a really good way to improve the plan. The other thing is whether there could be any opportunity to encourage local plans to increase the amount of designation of local green space. We did a whole bit of work on what designations might help growing spaces to be more protected. And it was the local green space designation that came up as the most useful one. But actually, it's a lot of work for a local community growing space to get designated as a local green space. But maybe if there was an interest in the local authorities wanting to do that, they could support them to actually go down that process. So again, apologies for my fuzzy head and lack of clarity, but I think
that's really helpful. Actually, I think hopefully we've made some notes, because I think there's some really good suggestions in there that we can pass on to the Mayor. So thank you for that. So do you feel, though, we over the last 4 years that the policy G8 has actually had any tangible results in London? Do you think the lack of what you've identified as being ways of strengthening it up but not having that, do you think it's actually achieved anything in across London?
It's really hard, isn't it? It's hard to talk about the absence of losing us, about the sort of I can't think of the way of explaining it, about not seeing a loss, I suppose. So I think, I don't think it's been a sort of a magic bullet in terms of saving food growing spaces and or seeing an increasing them. But I think it is, it's one of the things that when Andre was talking about, like, what are the 4 things that are needed, it's one of the top-down things that you need. You need a sort of planning infrastructure vision for where food growing sits within all of that. So I think I don't want to overplay it. I don't think it's made a massive difference, but I think the absence of it would be a loss. I think what we just need to do is build upon it.
Yeah.
But yes, I can't give you any tangible examples other than the occasions where we've used it in reference to saving a growing site.
Yeah, no, that's helpful. So we've got a new London plan due in 2026. Without these extra teeth that I think you've suggested, which I think are excellent, do you think there would be any meaningful progress if the Mayor wasn't to give it some more muscle?
Is that for me again?
It's all at you. I'll open it up to the others later, but having the conversation at the moment.
Yeah, no, fine, that's fine. I didn't want to hog. So if we don't add any of the extra measures, will it make any difference over the next 4 years? I think when we ask our questions in the Good Food for All Londoners report and we refer to it, you know, it's hard to know the difference that makes. I can't say really, to be honest. It's hard for me to predict whether it will make any difference in the next 4 years. I think without a set of things going on around it, either beefing up the policies or someone actually working with that policy to see how it's being implemented at a local level, it's hard to know. It's this thing, it's like, if you're not going to measure it, how do you know, is it important to you? I think maybe we need to start measuring the impact of some of these policies by asking those questions to those people that, you know, so maybe that is a question that we should be asking local authorities is, does this policy have any impact in your decision? And we'd have to be sort of holding our hands up if they're saying, you know, not really. So
Okay, thank you. That's really helpful.
It is a very good question. It is a very good question. We love having it in there.
Very sweet of you.
But you're right. It might just be a little bit lacking in lustre at the moment.
Okay, thank you. I won't be asking, as a vegetarian, I won't be asking the mayor to beef it up, but I'll ask him to make it more impactful. You've heard the conversation I've been having with Sarah. Would anyone else like to add to that conversation at all, please? Sorry, Pauline. Without my glasses, it's almost impossible to see you.
It's Pauline. I feel like I'm on university challenge suddenly. Just to add to what Sarah said, I think if we are looking at land allocation potentially and trying to improve that for community food growing or peri-urban farming, we also need to be understanding the lengths of the leases, particularly if there is a focus on enterprise growing or economic activity, for that to be meaningful, and also the cost in terms of like the rates, annual rates of the rentals, and whether they are at market rate, commercial rate, peppercorn rate that some of the larger peri-urban farms do have. They're all really important things to consider. It's not just about land. It's like if you've got land for 12 months, that's kind of meaningless. It's greenwashing to make a neighbourhood look nice and gentrify it in some cases. So meaningful land allocation that is looked at specifically to understand how and why and who it's been allocated to.
That's a very good point, actually. Very good point. Did anyone else want to add to that at all? Professor Andre.
I mean, I would just say having urban agriculture written into policy is absolutely critical. But because without that, nothing can happen at a formal level. So the first step is to get it written into policy. Ideally, urban agriculture is part of the essential infrastructure within the London plan. You know, if you want to take it seriously, we have roads, essential infrastructure water, essential infrastructure food growing, essential infrastructure to transition to a more equitable, sustainable, circular system. So that's absolutely critical. But obviously, like loads of policies, lots of examples, you can think of things that are sort of aspirations or slogans, but don't have teeth underneath them. So, so underneath that, it needs then the will and the support to make it happen. And I mean, just to give an example of like why it's important to have it written into policy, going back several years, in Cuba when there was the crisis of just people not having food, it was necessary to have urban agriculture written into the planning policy so that the planners would accommodate it, because in their frame of view, this wasn't to do with urban design, it wasn't, so we won't make space for it. So having it written in is really critical, but then what do you do with it? And I think that probably raises a few bigger questions for where London wants to be in the future. So, and probably the biggest question I would say is, how does London view density? Because density became a shorthand for sustainable development. You have a dense city, it's sustainable, people don't need transport. But actually, it doesn't take any account of the environmental cost of a development. So a much more useful measure would be to say what percentage of food, water, and electrical needs are delivered from within the curtilage of a site, to see how it contributes to our ecological benefit, etc., etc. And that's obviously a huge question, but I think it's that sort of, at least questioning these things is really important. So having it in policy is really important, but then having it written in, but then thinking about how we work with it. And I think that is where, again, joining everything up becomes critical, because one of the earlier questions was like, well, is how competing, sort of competition for land. So that's one of the things. Of course, there are financial constraints, there are all sorts of constraints, but I mean, that is where design comes in, like urban design, architectural design. That's what that does. And it's always trying to balance qualitative and quantifiable kind of benefits. So I think really it does need that holistic view if you want something to happen. Well, if we don't have it written into policy, I'm sure it will reduce the food growing in London, but it won't eliminate the projects that have been initiated by people who are committed and are doing it, from a vocational kind of passionate position. So yeah, so I think it's really important.
Sandra.
Okay. Oh, sorry.
I just want to add to that. London is such a great. Hello, Hua. Yes. So London is such a beautiful, vast city, and with that comes a lot of wastage and pollution. So food growing, urban agriculture is so important for the development of London and us, because it tackles those issues. It tackles climate justice. So that's what I wanted to also add to it. Thank you.
Maybe something else for the London plan is considering ways to further encourage or mandate food-growing spaces or multi-purpose spaces within new developments, particularly because of the context of ambitious housing targets by this government. So that's one more specific one to maybe look at. I suppose mentioned already the Land Commission and supporting or finding a way to give this framework to other boroughs and working together. And also locating food growing in the wider context of food sovereignty and local food growers, food markets, community wealth building and food security. We've got a good example in Southwark of the Walworth neighbourhood food model, bringing the different things together.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Just before we move into the last section, I'm going to come to Assembly Member Cooper. I just want to acknowledge we're running about 10-15 minutes behind, so hopefully you're still okay to give us your time. Thank you for that. And to the GLA panellists who are going to be here, thanks for your patience. Assembly Member Cooper.
So we're obviously making it clear that there's a review of the London plan that's in the offing. The current one, the research was done between 2016 and 18. It then went through the examination in public in 2019, was finished at the end of 2019. So although it's called London Plan 2021, that's because it got lost on the Secretary of State's desk during 2020. Not quite sure what happened to Robert Jenrick, but no doubt we'll find out soon what he's doing these days. But that means that the plan is somewhat dated, and we may, as a committee, decide to put in some views where we agree them on a cross-party basis. We might also put in views as political groups. I just wondered if any of you were planning to make submissions in this specific area to the plan to help strengthen it going forward, because it's obviously going to cover the years 2026 to 31, which is pretty critical in terms of how we meet the climate emergency. I can encourage you to do that. I can see Sandra's nodding, but I don't know if you were thinking of doing it, but perhaps the way to frame the question is, why don't you?
May I? You can hear me? Yes, absolutely, 100. I think it's really important that we get the views of the people on the ground to be able to move forward and shape agriculture or food growing in London. So yes, I would love to make my voice heard. Thank you.
That's fantastic. Pauline, will you be putting something in?
I'm just thinking back to this committee and the call for evidence that took place and wondering how successful or not successful it was. I'm an individual. I'm not tied to any organisation in any capacity. I think some support and some better information around what is required for the submission process would be useful if the desire is to kind of engage more people.
Okay, that's something that we can probably take away and maybe communicate with you for onward transmission. Thanks.
Thank you, and I can see Sarah from Sustain nodding away as well, which is good to see.
Yeah, I just was going to add as well, I think, we try and encourage our network to either sort of take on board some of the things we're sharing or get their views. So we do try and do a little bit of consultation on it, but it is always additional work. And planning it's not everybody's language. So not everybody understands the sort of specific spatial elements that you're looking for. So people will come up with lots of ideas about, can we fund capacity building and that sort of thing. So I think there is, there's a need to sort of better equip people to understand what the planning processes are all about. But we would definitely, if we're still got any energy left in us at that point, but yeah, we've already started sort of putting together some ideas about how we can see an improvement, a few more teeth on the sort of policies that we've got, and a bit more of a focus on the wider fringe farming, peri-urban farming element of it. So yes, we are hoping to do that. I'm not quite sure if there's dates and stuff yet for that, so do keep us up to date on that.
Thank you, Sarah. That's a point really well made, and really hear Pauline's point about that these things have to be accessible, and it's not necessarily people's language, so we've got to go to people. Assemblymember Mahfouz.
Thank you, Chair. So before I come to my questions, actually, I was just really struck by what you said, Sarah, about the targets. And I think one of the things that's been quite evident from the conversation so far has been the lack of data and in terms of where we are on food growing across the city. So actually, if we were looking at targets, certainly from a strategic point of view, I think we'd be looking at outcomes that we want to achieve, the purpose of why we're doing this in the first place, behind the what drives the conversation that we're having this morning, and therefore what we want to achieve in that sort of 10-year time frame. However, if we're coming from a baseline where actually we don't really have that baseline in terms of data, you'd probably be talking about inputs, so access, data around access, or outputs of what's happening on a sort of local scale. So either yourself, Sarah, or perhaps yourself, Andre, in terms of what you feel would be useful, tangible targets that we could try and incorporate going forward.
Andre, were you going to go first?
I don't mind, well, one simple one is going to be something to do with area, square meters of space actually devoted to it. That's probably relatively easy to measure, though everything needs measuring. The other one that, and then what you have to be again aware of in measuring these things is, as we've all said, these benefits are across a kind of a portfolio of activity. So it's probably what you're looking for, is more a kind of a chart that indicates how multiple sort of impacts are being achieved. But one of the simple ones would, of course, be the amount of food produced, and that's difficult to measure. So you'd probably have to set some maybe targeted sites where you would try to measure this to get a generalized output, because if you try to measure that across every site, it's a huge task, and it's probably too difficult to do. There are examples where people have tried to do that in New York in sort of 2000s, with growers doing it themselves or doing it in a more kind of
measured way. So quantifiable stuff's really important. I would ask if boroughs are identifying the place-making potential of urban food-growing spaces in their development plans, and if they there is an understanding or a target set for how the food-growing spaces also contribute to biodiversity gain. So I think place-making, biodiversity gain, and a thing that would be interesting to do, if it were possible, would be to look back a little bit at projects that are established and get a sense of how we define success. So, you know, is that how long they have existed for, of which in London we have some really, you know, great examples of projects that have had a life and are sustainable. Yeah, but I think if asking in the London plan to make the connection between placemaking and food growing, biodiversity gain and food growing, it's linked to the circular economy, these are important things, and then finding some achievable, quantifiable output which are to do with metrics and measurements. So the access to your site would be a good one, walking distance, area, yield if possible. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Andre.
Yeah.
And yourself, Sarah?
Yeah, I mean, just reinforcing a lot of what Andre just said. For a long time, Capital Growth did have a really strong baseline on all of this. So we knew how many food growing spaces in our network. And we've supported about 4,500 spaces since we launched 15 years ago. And we had pretty good data on how many of those spaces were active. We do an annual survey, so we can extrapolate and sort of see how many people are engaged in it. At the moment, we're just so down on capacity. It takes a huge amount of effort to maintain a database of 4,500 contacts. And at the moment, we've got a 0.6 staff member. So we've got someone working 3 days a week to deliver a program and try and manage that network. It's just impossible. So in the absence of anyone else seeming to care about it, and this is what I was saying about whose job is it to care about the London-wide picture, why is it just Capital Growth that seems to care about this at the moment? We've not been able to drill into all of that anymore, and to be so we know we've got about at least 800 active, but we haven't drilled it in to see how many more are active. So I think, yeah, area of land is relatively easy to do if there's a little bit of investment in what's, you know, an incredible bit of infrastructure that the GLA have developed with us over the last 15 years. There's also things like the number of allotments and how many allotments are being lost. I think there's quite a good picture, or allotment waiting lists have often been used as a sort of a bit of an indicator of where we're at in terms of demand. Appreciating that sometimes people sign up to an allotment and they don't really know what's involved in it. Having just taken one on, still there, don't worry. Things like how many people are involved in it could be another metric. Again, I don't know if this is suitable for the London plan itself, but I think these are interesting things for us to consider. The productivity stuff, we've actually done a lot of that, measuring productivity using a community science approach. So we've got the harvestometer where people can track what they've grown and create a monetary and CO2 saving value from it. I think putting stuff like nature recovery into that database so that people can start recording, and we've started to have early conversations with Giggle, with the data service within the GLA, about how we could incorporate something into our dashboard where people measure species and that feeds straight into the Giggle London database. So I think there's some really interesting creative ways that we could create some of those metrics. Then in terms of the outcomes and actually what we're trying to achieve on the ground, you know, that requires a bit of investment. As in the GLA to actually look at this as a 5-year project rather than a year, you know, even when we were getting the small amount of funding. And when I say small, it was about 15k that we were getting from the GLA. It was only ever a year on year. And it was only ever agreed in like September for the rest of till March. So I think it just needs a totally different approach if we're serious about seeing what the impact of this is over the next 5 years.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And I don't know if you'll have seen, but plenty of nods going there when you were listing the types of outputs and outcomes that we could measure. So incredibly helpful from both of you. And I think I share those frustrations in terms of having run a charity myself in terms of funding. But I guess the landscape has been very much for local authorities, including the GLA, of only getting very late settlements and only knowing from hand to mouth in terms of year to year what their funding position has been. So that, and obviously that trickle effect in terms of organisations that get funded then has an impact. I'm going to move on to, obviously it's Black History Month. Oh, sorry, Pauline. Yeah, go on.
Sorry, I just going on the back of what was said, I just think it's really important to add on some public health metrics to food growing activity in terms of the formal and informal running of social prescribing activities, the reduction of social isolation, access to quality food and distribution of quality food that St Gardens are doing. I just thought it was important to put that in.
I think a lot of the Good Food for London measures, they tell you what you need to do. It's the joined up things and the impacts, all you're just saying. So I think the work Sustain have done with that is something to look back at and would be really useful.
Thank you so much. So, as I was just saying, it's Black History Month, and obviously this month we've got yourself here, Pauline, from Roots into Food Growing Project. In the report that you produced, you concluded that Black and people of colour face systematic exclusion from green spaces, and you've already identified today a number of barriers and recommendations for change. You talked earlier about a lack of feeling welcome, a lack of agency in becoming stakeholders, and obviously some of those practical challenges around things like lease deals. What do you feel are the biggest barriers for Black and people of colour in terms of getting involved in this?
I'd say the biggest barrier for me when I was running the Roots into Food Growing project, the project didn't have establishing a network as part of its brief. It was something that happened organically. There are a lot of growers from different communities who are not part of the membership of Capital Growth, and Capital Growth, with its limited capacity and the big remit that you've heard about today, simply can't reach. There are people growing food all over who wouldn't identify with this room and what is being talked about. I wouldn't necessarily step forward to contribute to policy or submitting evidence. Therefore, they're not part of the conversation. So for me, the biggest I guess, ask or request is how can we better, and what organisations should be involved in trying to reach those people, and how can we better resource them so that they have the capacity and a level of equity in this conversation.
Thank you. And Sandra, obviously, been involved with this as well. Is there anything that you feel you wanted to add in terms of barriers? I know you obviously mentioned some before, particularly around support, and actually that's what Pauline was just talking about there. What sorts of support do you feel would be useful in this area?
As Go Grow with Love, but generally as a horticulturist in London. Generally. Obviously, the first thing that is access to land, security, access to land, because therefore we can't make plans, long-term plans, if we don't have that security to access to land. Capacity building, so that we have the people in the right roles to support and promote the work that we're doing, and also collect that evidence and do the community engagement consultations that are so needed to gather the information that we need to shape, that would help us shape the projects or the regions. And financial implications, obviously financial. We don't measure the work that we do through finances, we measure the work that we do through how much people can we help, how much people can we feed. And those levels of measurements may not be accessible to everybody. We do it our way, if that's, so in terms of support, definitely there's a gap there, and there's a need for support on how to structure things accordingly, but simple, because as, like Sarah said, there's a language barrier also, and people that, especially melanin-rich people, we don't necessarily use or want to use that language. We are farmers, a lot of us are farmers, we come from farming backgrounds, we come from places where not necessarily cities, but rural places all over, not just in the UK, but all over the world. And we try to mimic that way of living here in the city, bringing people together through food growing, so that we, just bringing people together for food growing. Thank you.
Brilliant feedback, thank you. And back to yourself, Pauline, obviously with the project that you had, what changes have you seen since doing that?
I've observed the emergence of more food growing spaces being run by Black and brown people, whether or not those spaces have core funding so that people are actually paid to manage the spaces, which I think is really important, or they have any long-term access to land is a different issue. I've observed overall the shift in thinking about food growing as a doing to kind of activity where funded people run activities for the community as, I don't know, daycare is the wrong word, but community engagement structured in a way to people actually taking food growing and food sovereignty as a very personal, critical issue that they care passionately about and they want to get engaged with. I think that's across diversities. It's also a lot more present in younger people coming through. I think, don't know, none of us are really young here. I think there would be a really different perspective from younger people about what they think of food growing, food systems and biodiversity.
Actually, I'm going to come back to that point in a bit, but from your experience in mentorship at Black Roots, have you seen any, you talked about a couple of good practice examples of food growing landscape for ethnic minority, so you just want to specifically focus on ethnic minority growers. So you talked about the Black Farmers Market in Brixton and you talked about Philadelphia. So were there sort of local or global solutions that you feel like we could get more Black and people of colour into growing food here?
Yeah, I mean, as part of my, if you think about Sarah's challenge to kind of get capital growth to continue funding, I was kind of doing the equivalent from a standing start with just me and no resource to effectively, because of the demand from people not affiliated with any membership organisation, the need for representation from those individuals and organisations was very strong. Sorry, what's the question? It's a lot to run a membership organisation. I take my hat off.
So, I absolutely, and I applaud the efforts.
I think it's underestimated the need for capacity, whether that is capital growth or for something like Roots into Food Growing, should that be funded again to respond to you, to deliver the metrics, the data that you need, to support individuals on the ground with inquiries about how do I get a piece of land, how do I do this, how do I do that, to be able to showcase gardens, to be able to run training from them. It's a hell of a lot, I think.
So, yeah, just on that point then, Pauline, what do you feel would be the best way to... Yeah, no, it's fantastic stuff, and it's just absolutely amazing what you've achieved. So just in terms of focusing that efforts to what elements of good practice you would want to really plough on and push forward with?
Core funding, sensible core funding to be able to run a membership body that allows it to do the policy engagement that is needed in this space, but also to do the outreach and connection to actually bring people in and to make sure that they're heard. It needs to cover that ground, I think. That's what's needed. It's literally the funding for organisations like mine and like Sarah's to actually be able to do that work effectively, because without all of this data, you guys are struggling to think about policy ideas, aren't you? You know, but part of our remit is to feed you with what you need, literally.
And you talked about young people, and clearly we need to engage new people in food growing and local growing across London. So how do we get across the importance of local food growing to young Londoners, particularly from ethnic minority backgrounds?
Trying to establish links between community food growing projects and some of the institutions that are running food growing training. Apart from Organically, none of the other, well, there's Forty Hall that Capel Manor have as well. None of the others have food growing space of any kind of significance. So be able to maybe pair locally, and for young learners who are doing horticulture qualifications to pair them with gardens gives the kind of garden capacity, and also gives the young person a learning experience where potentially they see something that represents them and gives them meaning. It's a struggle to get people into horticulture as an industry. It pays really badly. It's not very stable. You have to really either believe it and really commit to it and care and work 3 or 4 different jobs to keep a roof over your head, or you need to come from a background where you can put yourself forwards and have a level of privilege. It's not easy to do that.
Sandra, if you wanted to come in, and also if you've got anything around what sort of mix of community groups that are involved in horticulture at the moment, training at the moment.
Yep. So just adding to what Pauline said around young people in food growing, just want to say how important it is that school food growing is embedded in schools. I'm a teacher. I deliver training in schools. I deliver training to adults. I teach level 1 horticulture. I do a lot of work. A lot of it is not certified. It's just me sharing my experience, but I do it in a way that's so engaging that it attracts young people. Young people, when we deal with young people, it needs to be attractive, it needs to be fun. We have this mindset that food growing is just for elders, so we have done a lot of work, or I have done a lot of work at Go Grow With Love to change that narrative and make food growing really fun, colourful, accessible, and so there's a model there already in place, and I'm sure there's a lot of people out there that are doing great jobs that haven't been heard. So networks such as Roots into Food Growing that Pauline is running or has been a part of putting it together is so important, because it gives those voices, and also it collects that information that you need to know and I need to know, so that I know how to shape the projects to feed those people.
Just to really briefly add on to that about accredited training, the cost of actually being able to be an accredited training centre for a community group is prohibitive, complex, gate-kept. So maybe with local authorities and local training providers working with community gardens to be able to do that would make a difference. To be able to get a accredited training as a young person obviously will add to your prospects and onward employment.
And it's on that point, actually, my next question, Pauline. So, and it sounds like there's an opportunity there around maybe use of the apprenticeship levy, maybe working with training providers like Capel Manor and others. And there's not a plethora of them, actually, across London or elsewhere. But and it's on that point. So do you feel there is the right mix of training opportunities available to support local food growing in London at the moment?
In my experience, I would query the diversity of people who are paid trainers in those institutions. I didn't really engage with them, I have to say, as part of my work. In terms of like keeping metrics around diversity, I'm not sure if they do. I am also conscious that most of the horticulture colleges in London are run very, very tightly in terms of HR, diversity and inclusion, those sorts of things. Their focus is on delivering courses and getting grants to deliver courses and deliver more and more. That's where they're at. They don't really have the bandwidth. So again, perhaps that is something that could be explored better through partnership working to give that security and also to give learners a better experience.
So are there particular recommendations you'd want for us to put forward to the Mayor on this particular area? I think to have a review of horticulture training bodies in London to look at their diversity inclusion, both in terms of students graduating from those colleges, onward opportunities if they are or are not tracking them, but also the diversity of the staff working in them and delivering training, and their kind of welfare and support for students coming from differing ethnic minorities.
I must say, yes, I agree with, just to move, I agree with Pauline said, definitely there's always room for shaping and improving. In my experience, when it comes to food growing and training people to grow food, I do it in allotments, I do it in parks, I do it over the phone, I do it on Zoom, I do it anywhere that there's a platform that means that I can share. And that's because, again, the lack of diversity in those training institutions, there's too much lack, they're teaching how to, or we are being taught how to grow food, but what kind of food? London is such a multicultural city. We can't just be learning how to grow spinach. We need to learn how to grow chocho, something that's different so that it fits all cultural groups. So that there's definitely a need to have that into the training available at the moment.
It's really great feedback from both of you. One final question I've got, which we picked up, didn't we, Sandra, when we did the visit to Organically, and it was we talked obviously a lot about the production of food, but actually in terms of the other side, the beneficiaries of this locally produced, good quality organic food, it's not a very diverse customer base at the moment. How could we, what can we do to really improve on that side of things as well?
Do you want to go first? No, you go first. No, you go first.
It's kind of pushing back to a question that's not necessarily ours to answer. It's Organically's, really. It's something that Sarah said as well. It's about the lack of metrics around food deserts and their connection to food growing spaces, places, until that's more understood, and how to better connect organisations that are dealing with kind of food aid, mutual aid in communities and food growing. Perhaps that could be a way to improve things. There is the scheme that Sustain are doing, which is in that area, working around local food supply and trying to improve it so there is greater access to fresh food. But those partnerships need to be better resourced. And there is something that, again, because we're in an environment committee, we're not talking about food and food supply. They're disconnected within local authorities where they need to be brought together so that effective solutions can be provided and actually potentially efficiency savings made.
I also agree that there's room to increase farmers markets. Because we saw by the Black Farmers Market how successful, and I mean successful, I mean super successful. I sold out within 2 hours, which has never happened before. I mean, a lot of the traders sold out within 3 hours. So there is definitely a need to have those places around London as well. And you know, yeah, I think that's what I would bring to the table, because there are food boxes around which, so those food boxes also need to include multicultural crops that fit the culture. I don't know if you know of this, but a lot of our crops are brought in suitcases. When we travel, we have this. They're brought in suitcases because we don't. We don't have them here in the UK. So if Auntie goes back to Africa, you know she's going to bring a whole suitcase of food to share with the family and with neighbours. That's what I've heard before. So I'm just bringing that to the table to share with you that there's ways that we can shape. Definitely the GLA can help to shape and improve and provide those places places of food available to everybody.
I think mentioning the Black Farmers Market is really important. The issues that they've had ongoing with the council about trying to run further markets in the space need to be understood and overcome. It seems ridiculous to me that a successful animation of a space is being held back by pettiness. In terms of kind of food boxes and access, there are kind of community food cupboards and pantries, mixed kind of success around London. Again, I don't know how cohesive that approach is, but is there a better way for local authorities to be linking those to community gardens? Obviously, there is a really ancient bit of legislation around allotments and being able to grow, to sell or to trade, etc. There are things that hold back community growers from being parts of these efforts that need to be bits of red tape that I think we need to just get rid of. Practical things, stuff around kind of food hygiene, food standards, training, etc., access, and better knowledge and understanding of those processes, so that if organisations need to do them and need to get the training, it is simple, it is accessible, it is clear what they need to do if they need to meet food standards. Thank you.
It's really helpful. Ruth, and then I'll give the final word to Sarah online as she's got COVID. So.
I think the neighbourhood food model is a really good one to look at, which brings together food growing with lots of the other things that have just been mentioned. Sort of having food hubs based in densely populated areas, which can cover lots of different needs in one place and link things together more. So we've got the Walworth neighbourhood food model as an example. I think that it's the reporting that Sustain do, I've just forgotten the name of, sorry. Looking at all these different aspects together, what's it called, Sarah? Sorry. Where you look at all the council's outputs.
Good food for all Londoners.
Yeah, that one. I think
and
that
beyond
one.
Beyond the food bank is the other chapter.
Yeah, so it brings together all these initiatives that are happening, like community fridges and linking food growing to different types of other public health work. Thank you.
Thanks, Ruth. Over to yourself, Sarah.
Yeah, I mean, just to say, I think the question you originally raised was about who has access to the organically grown produce that's grown, in places like Organically. And I think that there's a number of ways that we can look at that. The first is what we advocate for is a cash first approach. So actually, what people need is more money to buy food. And there are a number of ways that the local authorities and others and national government could be doing that. A recent bit of research that we've done is actually sort of slightly some polling that we've done with the Organic Research Centre has shown that actually people on the lower income are the most organic enthusiasts. So this isn't about when people have got the money and even on a low income they try to choose it. I think the question of organic being overinflated in the supermarkets has sort of slightly distorted the picture. But I think the points that others have made about routes to market and how we can support more outlets that give direct access to sort of agroecologically organic grown food is really, really important. And building those hyper local links between growers and people buying food is really important. And one of the things we're working on is the Bridging the Gap, which is some innovative pilots about how we can get organic food to people on low incomes. And we are finding ways of doing that. How policy chooses to invest in those is the next way, how they overcome those. But we also, just to sort of make a point that it is really important that we're moving beyond the idea of surplus foods for people on low income. I've also heard some rumours coming out of the industry that AI is probably going to remove surplus in the next 2 years. So we're not going to have that. So we're building all this infrastructure around this notion of surplus food. And actually, in the end, all those surplus projects are going to be end up buying food anyway. So I think we need to really rethink what we see as a rights-based approach to food and a cash-first approach. And then we give people the options and the choices to buy the best food that they can for themselves. The other thing to say about food growing is, it's ultimate. People can go and grow their own organic food in a community garden. That isn't for everyone, we know, but it does give people access in the most basic way. And then beyond that, it's about those layering of routes to market. The more that we scale out the projects on the urban fringe, the more opportunity there will be to give people access to that food on a sort of sliding scale. But at the moment, those projects are also, really struggling to make things ends meet. But just to advocate the fact that organically do loads and loads of work to actually increase the accessibility to their veg and to find different ways for communities to benefit. So yeah, I think that is all on the agenda.
Fantastic to hear. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I just want to say a huge thank you to our guests, and particularly to acknowledge some of the things that you're carrying in the gatekeeping, and hopefully collectively as a committee we can work to remove some of those barriers over time. Thank you again to all of our guests. We'll be back in 5 minutes, so that will be 12:23 for our second panel.
Yeah, I think.
23.
Let's keep going.
Thomas. Thomas.
Now, to continue our discussion on local food growing in London, I'd like to welcome our guests for the second panel. We're joined by Jeremy Skinner, Assistant Director of Strategy, Insight and Intelligence at the Greater London Authority, and Anna Kaskan-Leon, hope I got that right, Senior Strategic Planner, London Plan Team of the Greater London Authority. I'm going to pass straight over to Assemblymember Cooper.
Thanks very much, Chair. We've heard quite a few references to the mayoral food strategy and the 2023 implementation plan. And I wondered, maybe come to you, Jeremy, is what's the current status of the mayoral food strategy and what are we doing over the next period to take it forward?
Yes, certainly. So I think the context, as you'll be familiar, is that since the election, the GLA has been reviewing the way in which it develops its programmes from, top to bottom, essentially reconfiguring the way that we work around a series of outcomes that the mayor is interested in achieving through mandates to senior responsible owners, and then a series of programmes that will deliver against those outcomes. And this is quite a revolutionary approach within the GLA. I think and I've been at the GLA quite a long time, and I think it's the first time that we've seen a kind of root and branch review of the fundamental purposes of the GLA and how it wants to go about its business. And I think that's very important context because food, of course, touches upon so many of the outcomes that we want to see achieved in the city in terms of health, biodiversity, sustainability, improvements in education and understanding about how the environment works, as we've heard from some of the contributions earlier. So I would say that at the moment the food strategy and its delivery is very much in a period of kind of patience and waiting, but also we're in a process of engaging, really about to embark on engaging with those SROs on how we can ensure that the food strategy and the implementation plan of some years ago is updated and refreshed and maintained in our strategies, programmes, policies going forward. So we're just at that, inevitable moment fairly shortly after an election where the GLA is, rethinking how it's going to do its business. We've got the draft budget coming up in a few weeks' time, but we're still really fairly well at the beginning of that process. Final budget early next year. We have the government's budget, and then we have the spending review also to gear up to for next year. So I think those are the moments of opportunity that we see. And my role, along with the food policy manager position that looks at food holistically and full-time, is to ensure that we bring those strands together into a coherent approach, akin to the food strategy and the implementation plan, but updated for this kind of new world that we're working in.
Okay, well, you mentioned the word opportunity. It does also sound like there might potentially be a threat because we're still in the situation where we don't know what's going on with sustains funding after March 2025. And I think we've just heard very eloquently from Sarah Williams about the current impact of the low level of funding and the uncertainty post-March. So I'm hoping that that situation can be resolved sooner rather than later, but it doesn't sound as though that's necessarily going to be the case.
Well, all programmes, of course, when they go through a budgeting process, one of prioritisation and so on, there is that element of, concern and jeopardy. Those aren't my decisions. Those will be mayoral and political decisions, as we know.
Okay. Well, I was also going to ask you how you saw the food security and local food growing strategy fitting into the Mayor's target around making London net zero by 2030. But I guess the caveat that we've just gone through in detail will apply to that as well.
Yes, I think so. I mean, perhaps, important to recognise, as your background paper shows, that Londoners perhaps consume 1% of the Londoners consume food of which 1% is produced within its boundaries. So, sort of the food sort of cycle, production, consumption, and its contribution to climate change within London is obviously relatively insignificant. The more interesting aspect is how we consume things more generally and their impacts and their wider ecological footprint, which is always something I've been interested in exploring.
So how much opportunity, you may not be able to answer this, is there to prioritise food security within the development of the Mayor's missions, or contribute, or seeing it as part of? I know net zero is going to be a theme through all. Food, of course, as we've just also discussed, falls into quite a few.
It does.
Is there any chance of it getting some sort of priority within the missions?
So we have, the missions that will be developed in line with the government's missions, which the London Partnership Board will champion. I think there will be scope potentially for food within those, and indeed within the programmes that the 15 or so programmes that are being developed as we speak. And we know, I know from discussions with the Mayor's office that they are very keen to ensure that food is integrated within those. The question is how we do that most effectively, because inevitably there is a need to champion the benefits of the food strategy and to incorporate food policy within that diversity of programmes. And I think we heard from the speakers earlier that that understanding is relatively precarious and it's vulnerable. And I think we have an opportunity to remind, senior officials within City Hall and beyond of the integral, elemental nature of food and its relationship with a whole array of public policy areas. And that's going to be my job over the next few months with Mark to make sure that we make that case.
I suspect we may be writing to the Mayor as a result of this meeting to make the case around food security, health, net zero, and a number of other areas that we know that food impacts on. So in terms of the food strategy implementation plan, just looking at the sort of implementation of the current rather than the future, it stated that work would be undertaken to consider how to utilise larger scale funding to help enable more food growing in London. Has any funding of that nature been identified?
For this financial year or for future financial years?
Both.
Because we're looking, I was interested in Sarah's comments on the capital growth programme. Of course, the amounts given to capital growth are relatively small in the overall scheme of the GLA's budget. Yeah. And I need to investigate what's happened to the funding for this financial year. But for future financial years, as I say, that's going to be part of the budget process.
Okay, so future years tied up in our previous discussion. So the committee wrote to the Mayor earlier this year. You probably know we've already looked at food earlier on, just before the election, and then we've had a visit after the election. And we called for a continuation of an increase in funding to capital growth. Are you saying that's still something that might potentially be looked at in this year? I mean, it is such a small amount of money. Is there anything that can be wired across into their budget? It would really help them.
I think we should, watch this space. I'm not going to promise anything here and now in terms of funding. I know that Sarah has been seeking various sources,
I think would be the word.
So we've heard the case.
Okay, so there's no point me saying when might a decision be made on this. Then this is not something we're in a position to say at the moment.
No.
Okay. And finally, I want to come over to you now, Anna. What plans are there to update policy G8? You heard me ask the others earlier if they were planning to put in anything into the consultation on the revisions to the London plan, which are going to go through. Is that something that you're planning to do from the food team to make sure it's as strong as possible? For example, we've just discussed the right to grow. Is that something that you might consider submitting? We might from the committee, but will you?
Sure. Thanks for the question. We have had preliminary conversations with Sarah and with Graham Willis from CPRE around food growing, particularly peri-urban farming and supporting community growing, considering how we might be able to revise the policy if required. Honestly, we haven't looked at right to grow as yet, but that is something that we can definitely do. We're at a pretty early stage in the London Plan review process at the moment. And yeah, it's something that we can definitely seek to address.
Do you think the changes that are likely to come through from to the NPPF, the National Planning Policy Framework, might help us in this area?
Yeah, that's a really good question. There definitely are some changes needed with regard to food growing. I mean, it's quite scarcely mentioned at the moment. I imagine that the SPADs are currently reviewing a lot of responses from various organisations on the 106 questions they asked about the NPPF.
Do you know if the mayor or the deputy mayor or one of the deputy mayors has responded to the NPPF on and included considerations about food growing in their response?
I imagine, I know that the London Plan team prepared a response, well, not the London Plan team, we coordinated the response, which had input from a variety of teams across the GLA, and my understanding is that, yes, that oversight was provided by the mayor, so I imagine he is across these, or his office is across these issues. Food growing was mentioned a couple of times. I do think, yeah, changes to the NPPF are imperative because as a regional body, there are only so many changes we can make to policy, especially when it is to do about land use. And the London Plan is, at the end of the day, a spatial development strategy that is only concerned with new development coming forward. It's difficult to do things.
No, sure, we understand that.
Or not impossible to do things outside of that.
Would it be possible for you to share what you submitted in relation to food growing to the government's consultation?
I can check with my management and potentially provide that to the committee if they're comfortable with that. I, off the top of my head, cannot exactly recall what I wrote, but it would have been something along the lines of ensuring that they were talking about deleting a footnote, and I think we said we didn't think that was a good idea, things like that, about not further weakening any provisions in the NPPF around food growing, especially given current, I suppose, the zeitgeist around housing and the extreme land pressure that London faces right now.
Sure. Well, if you can share it with us, we'd be very grateful. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Assembly Member Cooper. I realise it's not your decision, but I just want to echo the calls too that it seems like a false economy to cut this funding when we've just heard so eloquently from Sarah what a difference this makes. We also heard particularly from Sandra and Pauline about the gatekeeping, and that presumably will just get worse if organisations like Capital Grow aren't even able to provide the basics. But anyway, that's been said. Assembly Member Roberts, I know you wanted to come in here. Call you on the hop.
There we are. Thank you. Just to continue on this business of the London Food Strategy Implementation Plan update. This is November 2023, so it's not even a year old. And it says, the Mayor will carry out the following: support capital growth, a programme to increase the number of local community food growing spaces across London being delivered through Sustain. I'm assuming that the Mayor signed that off as the policy, that he was ready to put his name to that. So why, within the space of a year, do we see that support seems to have vanished away?
Well, as I said, I think needs to sort of wait for those decisions. Whilst since the implementation plan took place, as I've mentioned, we've been going through a whole restructure of the way the GLA consider its programmes and budgets. Yeah. So, we need to make sure that conscious decisions are taken to avoid things falling through the gaps, of which food, by its very cross-cutting nature, it is one that is vulnerable, and we need to make sure that it is supported. On the specifics of the funding decision on the capital growth allocation, as I say, let's just watch this space.
I appreciate the watch this space message, but this is, if this was 3 years ago, then that would be one thing. This is November 2023, and it clearly says the Mayor will support capital growth. And we're watching this space already. It does feel as though this was something which may have been thrown in to look nice just ahead of an election, cynics may suggest.
Well, those are your words, not mine.
Clearly, the value of mayoral support can go down as well as up. Thank you.
Can I just clarify, because I'm worried I've misunderstood, that to avoid things falling down the gaps, that isn't necessarily going to have its own protected policy space at the moment. It just doesn't quite add up to me. I don't know if there's another way to explain it.
No, it will have its... I mean, we have the food strategy, as we know. We know that the Mayor's Office is committed to ensuring that food as a policy area is maintained. But in the rejigging of our whole approach, we need to make sure that the widespread benefits of devoting policy attention to food is then reflected in all those programmes. So that is just a complex task, and it's also a task of refreshing the minds and memories of policy colleagues around the building of the benefits of taking a holistic approach to food. And so that's what we need to continue to embark on. I suppose the way I put it is that a lot of what the GLA has been, disassembled and is being put back together again, we're still right at the middle of that, arguably still in the middle of that process, or even at the beginning of that process, to make sure that at the end of that we have a coherent set of programmes and policies that support all of the outcomes that the Mayor is trying to achieve for the city.
I appreciate that, and I'm cognizant of the fact you're not a political appointee in that sense. But
indeed,
this sounds like reassurance that the Mayor won't in the future be saying, for instance, food is not my responsibility, or this does not come under me. Okay.
I certainly haven't heard that message whatsoever.
Thank you, Assemblymember Roberts.
Thank you. Just to check or get clarification, once everything lands, there will be necessarily concern amongst partners and other organisations that support or clarification may evaporate again within a year's time. What sort of timescales will we be looking at once we've got the final landed position going forwards? Because we need to give that certainty to organisations.
Okay, so I mean, as the Chair noted, I'm not a politician in that sense. So, but if we think about where we have been in the past in public expenditure terms, we haven't had a spending review since 2016. Local authorities and the GLA have only had annual grants for the last 7 years. We are looking forward to a prospect of, obviously, a budget in a few weeks' time, a few days' time, and then a spending review which should set multi-year allocations to departments. That's the anticipation for the first time in almost a decade, therefore. And I don't know, I can't speak for my finance colleagues on the Budget Performance Committee, but I guess we as policy officers would be looking for similar back-to-back arrangements for long-term funding arrangements that we can then ensure that our partners throughout civic society also get the benefit of that certainty. So I kind of see it very much from that sort of macro level, and then we need to translate it into particular programmes.
Assemblymember Mahfouz.
Thank you, Chair. I mean, I'm quite surprised by Assemblymember Roberts' question, given he is the leader of a local authority, and he will know firsthand what it's been like for local authorities who have been given hand-to-mouth, year-to-year funding agreements in place. And of course, the goal and the dream is to make sure that we've got long-term funding arrangements in place for these sorts of projects, as we've heard very clearly earlier. For any sort of project, particularly on such a strategic objective, we've got to have that multi-year funding in place so that projects can, can have certainty of where they're going to go. But we can't expect that to happen overnight when the government has not been delivering that for a number of years. And clearly we've got a budget that's coming up in a few days' time, which in all reality, we'll only be able to put another one-year assessment on the table whilst that work that needs to happen is going on, so that we can ensure that that longer-term funding is in place. But I think what we've also heard from Jeremy, from Anna, is that actually that longer-term strategic vision and rethinking about how the GLA spends its money is going on now. We can either criticise it for doing that, but actually it's probably, we would say, is the right thing to do strategically, where that direction is going to go. How do you embed food production, and it doesn't just sort of sit as a standalone small pocket of money year on year? How do we really embed it going forward as well?
1 second, I'm reluctant to start political conversation, so would you mind saying, do you agree on the end of that? And I'll let Jeremy answer, and then Gareth, you can make your point with do you agree, and then we'll move on. Bassam, can you just say, do you agree?
Do you agree?
So it's obviously for this committee to choose what to recommend in terms of the Mayor's priorities. It is the Mayor's decision to decide what those priorities are as expressed in his budget. We will support the Mayor in that. What I've heard from the Mayor's office is that they are keen for food to remain a central part of their policy making and to be woven through the programmes that are being constructed as we speak. What I am also reflecting is the truth, which is that the policy is vulnerable, because when compared to particular objectives, delivering housing or tackling some of the other determinants of good health or ill health, sometimes there's a risk that food can be deprioritised. And it's my role, working with others, to make sure that its priority is still absolutely foremost in policymakers' minds. There's always a battle for priority, both within politics, but also within bureaucracies. And I have taken on the task, if you like, or accepted the task of trying to embed food policy by hosting the role within my team, and I'll be championing it.
Thank you. Assembly Member Roberts, your perfectly formed scrutiny question, please, and then I'm going to move on.
Well, it's not so much a question, it's just an observation, if I may. First and foremost, promises which are made by my administration tend to last longer than a year. Secondly, I'm here to try to scrutinise the actions of the Mayor, not to defend them. You have your own remit, I have mine. Thank you.
Thank you. I am just going to move us on. Assembly Member Tyrrell.
Thank you, Chair. So this is directed to Jeremy, so good afternoon. What has been the greatest success of the implementation of the Mayor's food strategy?
That's a good question. I would have thought, I think probably the biggest success is the implementation of the universal free school meals policy, which, as you know, is now delivering free school meals to approximately 130,000 primary school children, from recollection of the statistics. So that potentially provides, of course, a route into the topic of the committee's deliberations today in terms of food growing and the relationships between school and community food growing and the food that people have on their plates at school. So I think that would probably be the answer I would give.
Thank you, and opening up to both of you. Within the implementation strategy update of 2023, the robust safety net recovery mission was established. Could you advise what the outcome has been?
Pardon, sorry, I didn't hear you.
Oh, sorry. So I'll read that again. Within the implementation strategy update 2023, the robust safety net recovery mission was established. What was the outcome of that?
I think you'll have to ask others, because, of course, the robust safety net mission was covering financial hardship as well as food security and other aspects of the safety nets. My, again, recollection from the broader statistics in that policy area is that as a result of the championing of a number of benefits that are available to people and advertising those, advocating them, the uptake increased quite significantly. But again, I think that's somewhat beyond the scope of this particular inquiry.
Thank you. Yeah, fair enough. How much funding was made available for the food route capacity grant?
If I can write back to you, I think I have it in my brief, but I don't access it immediately.
What action has been taken from the Mayor's second iteration of the survey of Londoners on food insecurity? I will have to pass on that one and get some more information to you. Okay, and then finally on this bit, before I move on to the other question, how successful has been the new G8 policy on food growing, and how do you measure this?
Much like Sarah described, it is actually quite difficult to quantify. It's a policy that directs boroughs to include food growing or consider food growing as part of their local plans, rather than some of the other London plan policies which speak directly to development proposals and metrics and requirements. I did have a look at all the current local plans yesterday to kind of, I suppose, get a picture of how many of them have put in their own standalone food growing policies, or whether they're mentioned in other policies like open space or health. Again, this is a very high-level, quick review, but there were 15 boroughs that had standalone food-growing policies. Some of them more detailed than others. Obviously, if you expect, or you might expect, an outer borough like I think it was either Redbridge or Waltham Forest. One of them had quite a detailed policy. You might have inner boroughs that kind of just reflect what the London plan says itself. Then the rest of them either had references in, like I said, health or food growing policies, health or open space policies. And there were only a couple that made almost no mention, and I think one of them was the City of London, which is, again, relatively understandable given its spatial constraints. So, yeah, it's not, I can't answer it, again, with any kind of hard data, but I would suggest that since the London plan was published in 2021, there has been an uptake in food growing policies being incorporated into local plans, as the policy asks them to. And then a few of them are starting to get a bit more ambitious with what they're asking for as well. So in that sense, you could say that it is currently serving some or most of its purpose as it's written.
Thank you for that. So how is the GLA ensuring that the local nature recovery strategy and the green infrastructure framework identify current and potential food growing sites?
I'm not a member of the Green Infrastructure team, unfortunately. My understanding is the LNRS is a layer in the LGIF, effectively, which LNRS speaks more specifically to biodiversity and nature recovery, and then the LGIF is a spatial tool that will replace the All London Green Grid, and it will assist with the delivery and implementation of green infrastructure projects. There are definitely conversations that we've been having, so myself as one of the policy planners and with my green infrastructure colleagues, around how we can potentially introduce food growing as part of the LGIF. I mean, yeah, initial conversations, but the thought is there.
Thank you. Is there one improvement that springs to mind we could get from this framework that you'd like to share?
I mean, effectively, I suppose its entire purpose would be the improvement, which is actually identifying where we need green infrastructure projects delivered and providing a mechanism for planners and for industry to actually deliver those projects as and when needed, as opposed to, I guess, more generic requirements around spatial minimums or just BNG or something like that. It's a more targeted approach. So I'd say that would be the benefit of the LGIF.
Okay, thanks so much. I have nothing further, Chair.
Thanks, Assembly Member Mahfouz.
Thank you, Chair. And I just wanted to bring us back to the point of, obviously, food production and growing the supply of that, making sure that that goes to a more diverse cohort of people across London. And we talked about the finances earlier. That doesn't always need to be about additional funding. One of the questions I asked on our visit to Organically was around the opportunity, off the back of what you said there, Jeremy. Look, we've introduced universal free school meals to every primary school across London. That means there's an increased demand for food in, obviously, all of our schools. And there's an opportunity there to ensure that an increased percentage of that supply of food comes from local food grown within London. And that's just a simple use of the procurement processes that local authorities and schools have going forward. So what work has been done so far, and what opportunities would you see as us as a convening power to ensure that that is something that's driven for going forward?
Yeah, so clearly there are going to be opportunities from there. So, for instance, on my team, we're looking at the different diets of different communities, which then relates a little bit to what can be grown locally. We heard from one of the speakers earlier about how, food boxes need to contain a multitude of ingredients to reflect the variety of diets that Londoners have. In terms of the total scale, of course, local production is not going to meet the overall demand, but on the other hand, therein also lies huge opportunities. We know through other interventions like the London Anchors Institution Network that local supply is something which anchor institutions are being encouraged to think about when they review their procurement policies. So I think those are some areas of opportunity. I think just going back to sort of green infrastructure, many years ago I set up the infrastructure team and we worked on the London infrastructure plan, and we really gave a big push for green infrastructure to be seen as a critical part of the overall infrastructure of the city. But I do think we missed an opportunity then to also see that as a food growing opportunity as well. So I think that is something that Anna and colleagues will be working on. Yeah, so I think those are some of the responses to that. Thank you.
Thanks. Can I follow up on that? So we had a submission from Plant-Based Treaty. It was quite a lengthy submission to our Call of Evidence. Are there any conversations happening around how you can combine local food growing, just as Assembly Member Mahfouz just asked, but also to encourage schools to reduce their meat and dairy intake, which is good for the climate, it's cheaper for the school, and potentially good for diet?
I think this is an area where the activity is going to be much more within local authorities and on the ground. So although I'm sure we can pull together some information and evidence of those kind of conversations, what we again heard from the session this morning is that the local context is incredibly important, and that's where decisions over what available land supply actually exists, which are the community groups that are going to be working to encourage local food production, that is sustainable in terms of the personnel, the commitment. Those are very, very local decisions. The question is what support they have, which again is something we have clearly heard and will take back to others in the GLA in terms of both the strategic framework and also the funding that's available.
I'd quibble mildly, because I think what I heard from this morning, particularly from Sarah, was yes, for local context is really, really important, but actually the top-down leadership and strategy and deciding, yes, this is where we're going, feels really important. But
I absolutely got that point, and I was particularly struck, and we'll follow up this point about data, that we used to have good data, and now it has, we've slightly lost that overall strategic picture on provision. So I'll be sort of following up with my team and others about whether that's something we can plug. Obviously, I run City Intelligence, which has a number of data specialists. All these things will revolve around cost and priority. Collecting and maintaining data is not a neutral thing to do. It is expensive to do well.
Well, thank you very much for your time, both of you, and that draws the panel to a close. We've just got a few items of business to attend to, but please feel free to leave the chamber, the conference room. Can I ask the committee to note the report and the discussion? Can we also delegate authority to me as chair in consultation with party group lead members to agree any output arising from the discussion? Thank you. Can I ask the committee to note its work programme? Thank you. The next meeting of the committee is scheduled 6th of November 2024 at 2 p.m. in the Chamber City Hall. I have no more urgent business, which concludes today's meeting. Thank you.